In the 1950s and 60s, the US and the USSR jockeyed for dominance in the space and atomic races. It was a game of one-upmanship on a grand scale. Who could build the deadliest atomic weapon? Who could launch the first satellite? And who could get to the moon? But the Americans and Soviets were not the only ones competing for atomic might and glory in space. Britain, too, was anxious to build up her arsenal and explore the mysteries of outer space. Years were spent developing a homegrown system for launching atomic weapons and satellites. But days before Britain's own Prospero satellite lifted into the heavens on board her own Black Arrow rocket, the launch program was cancelled altogether. In World War II, Germany developed sophisticated weaponized rockets that could strike the Allies at will. There were no countermeasures for a V2 rocket streaming down from the skies and blasting holes in the neighbourhoods of London. Once launched, no interceptors were fast enough to reach them. The only way to stop them was to destroy them on the launch pad, or even better, wipe out Germany's ability to manufacture them in the first place. The Soviets and the Americans, recognizing the potential of rockets, were eager to seize the science and technology behind them for themselves. A Soviet rocket program had been put on ice at the start of the war, and Stalin was eager to reignite it.
The Russians had made a tremendous amount of developmental study in the late 1930s, but the Stalin purges stripped Russia of the ability to keep up, and so they went into a period of stagnation during the war, while the Germans accelerated with some very keen brains that had been working long-range rockets like the V2.
At war's end, both sides scavenged Germany for the keys to these weapons. The remnants of German science and the men behind it that had survived the relentless bombing raids were systematically collected as the Allies advanced. For the next few years, the experimentation that went on behind the Iron Curtain remained largely a secret. In the early 1950s, German scientists, who had been captured by the Soviets, began the long journey home. They had chilling news for the Allies about the mysterious activities in the Soviet Union. The world knew that the Soviets had atomic weapons, and the Soviets flexed their atomic muscles by testing their first bomb, First Lightning, on August 29, 1949, a bomb similar in operation to the one that had devastated Nagasaki. With each passing year, the Soviets detonated ever larger atomic weapons. To the dismay of the Allies, the freed German rocket scientists revealed that the Soviets had made rapid progress in missile technology. At war's end, they had captured the V2 production facility at Nordhausen. There were 30 complete examples of rockets there, as well as many of the scientists and engineers in charge of the site. By 1947, the Soviets were manufacturing copies of the V2, the R-1, and they were well on their way to building longer-range weapons. It would only be a matter of time before they combined rocket and nuclear technology into the deadliest of weapons. Long and short-range missiles armed with atomic warheads that could set whole cities ablaze at the whim of the Soviet leadership. Truman, looking to control nuclear proliferation, had been unwilling to share nuclear technology with Britain, even though she had been a significant part of the Manhattan Project, and the two nations had a common foe in the Soviet Union. In 1952, Britain proved she too was a nuclear power. It was then that she detonated her first nuclear weapon at Tremoy Island in Australia. With a nuclear attack looming, a V-bomber force was assembled capable of striking the Soviets. However, even with Britain's autonomous nuclear capability and bombers, Churchill recognized he would need the help of the Americans to deal with the growing Soviet threat. He hoped President Eisenhower would be a more generous atomic partner.
When Churchill went to America, he established a renewed relationship about cooperation on atomic weapons. Britain wanted what it called the Moscow Card, the ability to destroy and decapitate the Soviet leadership. It had structured its V-bomber force specifically on that capability. And so the range of the missile that Britain aspired to have was far beyond its capabilities in terms of indigenous research and tests that it had done. So it needed both the cooperation of the United States to assist back in with development of an atomic bomb, and it also needed help with the development of rocket motors for this aspirational long-range ballistic missile.
In 1954, Duncan Sands, the UK Minister of Supply, and his counterpart in the US, Secretary of Defense Charles Wilson, agreed that the two nations should work together to build up an arsenal of ballistic missiles as a deterrent to the Soviet threat. It was hoped that the Soviets wouldn't dare launch their own strike if they knew an equally potent atomic attack would fall upon them in return. The US was tasked with developing a long-range intercontinental ballistic missile known as the Atlas. Britain was unable to buy missiles directly from the US due to the restrictions of the 1946 Atomic Energy Act, and began development of her own medium-range weapon, to be known as the Blue Streak missile.
The interesting thing about why assistance was so important to the Americans is that until the end of the 1950s, the Americans were unable to demonstrate a truly intercontinental ballistic missile capability, one that would have a range of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 miles. But they were producing missiles like the Thor and the Jupiter, which would have a range of about 1,500 miles. And that was exactly perfect for the UK. So coming along, they could bleed technology they already were developing for their own medium-range ballistic missiles, 1,500-mile range, to slot that capability in, give it to Britain, and have that as a front line, front trench against potential Soviet aggression.
Putting the long-range project in American hands made sense. Geographically, home-based missiles would have to travel a much longer distance to get from America to the USSR than from England. More importantly, the US had deeper pockets to construct such weapons and greater experience in missile testing. Like the Soviets, they had poached Germany's greatest minds to unlock the secrets of her most powerful weapons. Under Operation Paperclip, Wernher von Braun, the genius behind the V-2 rocket, was brought to the United States. The Americans were willing to overlook his involvement in the Nazi Party and his use of slave labour, if it meant they could get an edge in the Cold War that was brewing. Working with the US Army, he and much of his old staff from Germany helped provide the V-2 missile program. As part of Project Hermes, using V-2 rockets collected from Germany, von Braun helped America pick up where Germany had left off. The British had also had the opportunity to test-fire V-2 rockets and study German research, but they still had a steep curve to climb to catch up to the Americans in rocket development. Although they had felt the devastation wrought by the V-2s, they were initially more interested in Germany's shorter-range weapons.
In Britain, it was believed that the German research on smaller-scale rockets would more immediately bring a greater benefit. Air-to-air missiles for air defence, and also rocket-assisted takeoff units for existing jet-powered aircraft. The alcohol and liquid oxygen of the V-2 was not seen as a progressive step for Britain because the country immediately after the war was not in a position to be able to invest in those big-scale technology projects.
De Havilland and Rolls-Royce worked together to develop Britain's Blue Streak missile. De Havilland had created the Comet, the Vampire, and the Fire Streak air-to-air missile, and they would use their aerodynamic expertise to build the missile's body, while legendary engine manufacturer Rolls-Royce would focus on the Blue Streak's rocket engines. The Blue Streak was powered by an engine with American heritage. The RZ-2 was essentially an uprated version of a rocket engine designed by North American Aviation and originally fitted in the Navajo cruise missile.
The Rocketdyne Company in America, a division of North American Aviation, was already churning out rocket motors of 150,000 pound thrust. They cooperated with the British in delivering to Rolls-Royce that capability. So Rolls-Royce took two of those engines, married them up into the Rolls-Royce RZ-2 to produce the 300,000 pound thrust of its long-range ballistic missile, Blue Streak.
Unlike the German V2s, which were propelled by a mixture of ethanol and water, oxidized by liquid oxygen, the Blue Streak engine used kerosene and liquid oxygen as propellants. One major question that still needed to be answered was how the nuclear warhead would react upon re-entry into the atmosphere. Rather than work out this issue on costly Blue Streak missiles, a smaller rocket was developed specifically for the purpose. It was known as the Black Knight.
Britain got a lot of information about this miniaturization of nuclear warheads from the Americans, but it had to develop its own re-entry vehicles, RVs as they're called. There was a need to produce a quick and dirty test vehicle to throw a warhead up out of the atmosphere, drive it down, to test the materials that would have to survive the enormous heat from friction with the atmosphere, as re-entering warheads would at the end of a ballistic missile flight to its target in the event of war. And that was challenging even the American machine, which had vastly greater assets and resources at this time.
The Black Knight was tested by Saunders Roe on the chalky cliffs on the western tip of the Isle of Wight. The 19th century fort there, built to defend England from incoming invaders, was transformed into one of the most sophisticated research facilities in the world. It was no small task. The terrain was radically altered. 10,000 pounds of chalk had to be shuffled into Scratchell's Bay. The resulting white scars had to be covered over with turf to prevent dust from whirling up during engine tests. Hundreds of electric cables for instrumentation and general service were laid under the newly paved roads. Raymond Wheeler, chief designer of the Black Knight, recalls the layout of this space-age facility.
There were two sites where the whole rocket could be test-fired, and those two buildings were spread out sideways, and in between was a control room for setting everything in train.
Rockets wouldn't actually be launched from the Isle. This was a test facility only. A duplicate site was built in Woomera, Australia, to send the rockets into space.
Well, Highdown was where we set the rocket up and just tested that all the control systems worked. At Woomera, we actually fired the rocket. And the reason for the difference was just safety. If something went wrong when you fired out of the needles, it could have landed anywhere, even Southampton.
The body of the Black Knight rocket was manufactured at the Saunders Roe Works in East Cowes, also on the Isle of Wight, while engine development took place at the Bristol Siddeley Works at Anstey near Coventry. Saunders Roe had already built an aircraft powered by a jet and a rocket engine.
I was working for Saunders Roe at the time when this all began, and we were building a mixed unit fighter aircraft called the SR-53. So we were experienced in designing rocket installations.
Black Knight was a tall, slender rocket, about 10 meters from base to tip, with a 1 meter diameter, about half the height and a third of the width of the Blue Streak. It could carry a 115 kilogram payload only, 10 times less than its big brother from de Havilland. The Black Knight initially used Gamma 201 rocket engines. These were liquid fuel engines with kerosene and high-test peroxide, HTP, a concentrated form of hydrogen peroxide, as propellants. HTP is a highly volatile substance first used by the Germans to launch their rocket-powered Comet interceptors in World War II. Special precautions and protective clothing were necessary to handle it. If splashed on the skin or clothing, it could result in a burn or even a fire. Each of the 4 rocket engines had about 4,000 pounds of thrust, or 16,000 pounds combined.
So these were relatively small engines. These were engines the size of which the Americans were putting in the back of aircraft to test them through the sound barrier and on up to Mark II and Mark III. So while they were using very volatile propellant combinations, the thrust themselves was really quite small.
Still, it was deemed to be powerful enough to propel the Black Knight several hundred miles above the Earth, above the atmosphere, and into space. Improvements in later model Gamma 301 engines elevated thrust to over 21,000 pounds. The rocket was controlled in flight by swiveling the motors, which changed the angle of thrust. To increase stability in the air, the Black Knight was fitted with 4 fins. Pods at the ends of the fins contained electronics to help the Saunders Roe creation on its journey into space. Additional instruments were housed in the nose cone, which separated from the rocket in flight and recorded what happened as it re-entered the atmosphere and fell to Earth. Once the engines were fitted and the rocket complete, it was transported down to the High Down test site. The Black Knight needed a passing grade from High Down before it could get a ticket for a space trip. Every aspect of an actual launch was replicated, and it was almost as dangerous.
The kinetic energy in an exploding rocket stage is considerable, and so the dangers attendant are colossal. It was a major step to have the test facility there and go through all of the processes except liftoff, but every single step and potential danger, as you would have actually at the launch site down in Australia.
The last 2 minutes of the launch were entirely automated. In the operations room, the sequence officer ensured that all connections were correct before locking up the unit. A red flag, hoisted outside, signalled that the site was active and a launch pending. The assistant safety officer checked that all was clear in the gantry. The firing circuits were signalled as ready, the main safety links were inserted, and the safety officer gave the all clear. At -2 minutes, the automated launch sequence kicked in. A red light came on, and Black Knight was alive. Every aspect of the test was recorded in the instrumentation room. Tape recorders, galvanometers, oscilloscopes, telemetry displays, and film allowed scientists to study every detail of the test. The rocket was put through its paces. The motors executed a pre-programmed pattern of movement to test yaw, pitch and roll. Everything went as planned, and the rocket engines were shut down. It was a small triumph for everyone at Saunders Roe and Bristol Siddeley, but Black Knight's main glory was still to come. An actual launch in Woomera. As the British edged ever closer to launching Blue Streak and the Black Knight rockets, the US continued testing their own Atlas ICBM. This was a liquid-fueled rocket burning liquid oxygen and kerosene, just like the Blue Streak. In June of 1957, the Atlas was ready for launch. If successful, the US would have had the world's first ICBM. The launch, however, ended in disaster. After a promising start, the rocket tumbled into the air and fell back to the Earth. It was a major embarrassment for the US, but things got even worse for the superpower. A month later, the Soviets announced that they had successfully launched their own ICBM, the R-7 Semyorka. There were serious doubts in the West that the Soviets were capable of such a feat, and the thinking was that it was pure propaganda only. On October 4, 1957, they gave the world all the proof they needed. On that day, the Soviets launched the Sputnik satellite into outer space. The pulsing, silvery beacon circling the globe was a constant reminder the Soviets had the edge in the space race. Sputnik was also a warning that it was only a matter of time before they could replace the satellite module with a nuclear warhead. It became ever more critical to the West to develop their own nuclear missiles.
The launch of Sputnik produced hysteria in the United States and a deep intake of breath across continental Europe and the UK. It's very interesting that the United States Information Agency, the USIA, through its embassies across continental Europe and in the UK, did a rapid survey of public opinion. And immediately after Sputnik, most countries in Europe, particularly France, thought that this had rewritten the balance of technological superiority and shifted it from the United States to the Soviet Union.
Back on the Isle of Wight, the Black Knight had passed all tests and was deemed fit for launch. It was packed in 2,000-pound crates, built by Saunders Roe, with special features to prevent moisture build-up on the long 14,000-mile trip to Woomera, Australia. On the 7th September 1958, the team from Saunders Roe and Bristol Siddeley finally discovered if all their years of hard work would pay off. The Black Knight was ready for launch. It carried no payload, as this was a general test of the rocket's equipment and the entire launch procedure. For several long moments, the scientists and engineers must have held their breaths as the clock ticked down. An explosion could have meant the loss of months of work and a black mark of the project. As the Black Knight streaked into the air, the teams from both British companies rejoiced. Britain had taken a giant step in the space race. America, too, had made great strides in ballistic missile development. The Redstone rocket was a direct descendant of the V2 and had been created under the guidance of von Braun. It was a short-range surface-to-surface missile with a strike distance between 100 and 330 kilometers. Like the V2, this was a liquid-fuel rocket which burned a mixture of water and alcohol with liquid oxygen. In August of 1958, a nuclear-tipped Redstone rocket was launched from the remote island of Johnston Atoll. When it reached 76.8 kilometers, the 3.8 megaton warhead on board detonated in an awesome explosion. The Americans had a deadly new nuclear weapon in their arsenal. However, just like with the atomic bomb, the Americans knew they could not hold a monopoly on it forever.
With America and the Soviet Union engaged in a massive arms race, both sides are eager to acquire the technology that will give them a distinct advantage over the other. Bombers, missiles, nuclear-powered submarines and satellites launched into space are all highly sought after during a period where the entire world could be obliterated with the flip of a switch. During this weapons race, Nazi scientists are brought over to both sides of the curtain, where the weapons that at one time were to be used against them are studied and developed further in order to produce a checkmate against the opposing power. The names Werner von Braun, Walter Dornberger and Hermann Oberth are usually mentioned when this topic in history is discussed. For it is their work that gives the United States the X-15, a rocket-powered plane that reaches the edges of outer space and holds the world record for speed, flying at over Mach 6. The X-20 Dynamic Soarer, a futuristic space plane that is to be used for multiple purposes, including the bombing of the Soviet Union from outer space. Designs demonstrating America's commitment to be the undisputed champion of Cold War weaponry. And while the names von Braun and Dornberger are etched in stone as the architects of American ingenuity, there is another scientist who is often overlooked by writers and historians. His name is Dr. Jürgen Sanger, a brilliant theoretician who has bigger dreams and aspirations than all the others combined. His ultimate goal is to produce a hypersonic spacecraft that can take passengers around the globe in mere hours. He has a concept that Nazi Germany desires to convert into a lethal weapon to be used against the United States. An idea that is resurrected from the ashes of the Second World War to be used as a game changer for whoever can master its concept. This is the story of Dr. Jürgen Sanger, one of Hitler's spacemen. The story of Jürgen Sanger begins at the turn of the century in the nation of Austria, where as a young child he is infatuated with the idea of man landing on the moon. Like many others from his generation, the idea of space travel galvanizes Sanger, who reads as much science fiction as he can acquire during his impressionable youth. One book in particular that captivates Sanger is Hermann Oberth's Die Rakete zu den Planetenraumen, or By Rocket into Planetary Space, a prolific blueprint of ideas.
He read the books by Hermann Oberth and all the other space travel books. Most of them were science fiction, but that's how he got interested in space travel, going to the moon, going to Mars, and beyond.
There was a lot of great scientists there with fantastic ideas, futuristic ideas. I mean, even Werner von Braun, who did the V2, I mean, his ideas were way ahead of anybody else.
Studying civil engineering at the University of Technology in Graz, he acquires his PhD in what would now be called rocket science. Sanger is a true rocketeer who, like others, must adapt to the new regime that is taking control of Germanic lands. During a period of intense military build-up, where Austria would soon be incorporated into the Third Reich, Sanger begins work on his magnum opus, a high-speed transport plane called Silbervogel, or Silver Bird.
It was his idea in the 30s, mid to late 30s, to build a high-speed passenger aircraft that could fly from Berlin to Tokyo in a matter of hours, or fly from Berlin to New York City in a matter of hours. It had nothing to do with a military aircraft. It had nothing to do with a suborbital rocket bomber. So the Silver Bird started out in Eugen Sanger's mind as a high-speed, high-altitude passenger plane. It's almost similar, I guess the idea would be similar, to the Concorde.
When you watch a rocket, when you watch a Saturn V or any rocket take off, you notice it takes off slowly and gradually gathers speed. Well, this is because the most energy in that is involved. More energy than any other aspect of that flight is involved in takeoff. So if you could find a way to make that ramjet, this huge ramjet engine and this huge bomber, take off without using any onboard fuel, you'd really have something there.
There was a debate among the German and Austrian rocket enthusiasts about whether you would use a pure rocket to launch you into space or whether you would use some combination of the airplane and the rocket, using a winged vehicle. So his Silverbird was an idea that he had, was one of many iterations of an idea for this kind of hypersonic or even orbital rocket plane.
It is a revolutionary concept. A vehicle capable of taking passengers from Berlin to Tokyo in mere hours by bouncing off the Earth's atmosphere.
Gravity would eventually want to pull it down. And so what Sanger would do, he'd fire up his 100-ton rocket engine, and he would dive down to about 25 miles altitude, where there's a very dense layer of atmosphere. Now, once this aircraft hit that dense atmosphere, it would bounce off of that, and it would be reflected back up again. It'd be like a child throwing a flat stone across the lake. It bounces along, skipping along. That would be the same principle for Sanger's Silver rocket.
Eugen Sanger developed a concept where you would launch a bomber, a manned bomber, into the stratosphere, into the high reaches, near reaches of space. And then you would re-enter the atmosphere and bounce back up and bounce back down, up and down. And they calculated that you could easily circle the world doing this with their 20-ton thrust Sanger ramjet engine.
While Sanger is not a man of war, his nation is on a path to war.
With all of these guys, you face the same issue, that they are space enthusiasts, but they're also nationalists. They're also, in some cases, quite Nazi in their beliefs. So there was no contradiction between their space enthusiasm and being asked to work on rockets as weapons. They saw, on the one hand, rocket weapons, whether it be rocket plane or pure missile, as duty, contribution to the nation, contribution to the Third Reich. At the same time, they saw it as a stepping stone to going into space. So they really didn't see much of a contradiction, if any, at all, between the two.
And very soon, Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, a man who will be responsible for Germany's aerial arsenal against the Allies, begins to take a serious look at the possibility of turning the Silbervogel into a deadly state-of-the-art weapon.
The Third Reich was only interested in weapons. The space ideas are all very nice and exotic, but they funded Sanger, they funded von Braun and others because they wanted weapons. They were out to conquer the world, and they needed the weapons to do it.
Although the United States presents itself as a neutral nation, their President Franklin Roosevelt is sympathetic to the nations of England and France. And as the 1930s come to a close, it is almost inevitable that America will enter the war one way or the other. Unfortunately for the Nazis, there is no available aircraft in their arsenal capable of reaching the United States and back to deliver a fatal blow. By 1939, the best means available is Germany's U-boat fleet, who, when given the call, will engage in unrestricted submarine warfare against America's shores. Traditional aircraft, known as the America bombers, are being designed and built on the fatherland during the war, but remain a giant question mark in terms of range and payload. In a country with a fascination for wonder weapons, spending enormous sums of money on ideas and concepts that in the end may not be realistic at all, it is only natural that Sanger's grand vision is given the green light by German war planners.
When he started working for the Luftwaffe in the late 1930s, I think he looked for a way to sell this idea. The Silver Bird was supposed to be a skip bomber, a hypersonic vehicle that would be launched probably from a sled. It would go into a suborbital trajectory, and it could extend its range around the world by essentially skipping off the atmosphere like a rock.
A group of rocketeers are organized and funded by Goering, with research and development to be done at the Hermann Goering Institute, located north of Hanover.
Hermann Goering was involved in rocketry, and he saw what the Army was doing with the V1, the V2, and he said, "Hey, I think I should be involved in this as well." So he started his own group of rocketeers, men who he could find who hadn't been picked up and picked over by Dornberger.
So he started to invent and manufacture power plants, and these were in rocket and pulse jets. And from that, he also designed mini fighters with pulse jets, which then led to the idea that perhaps, we could actually go into the atmosphere and have long distances and bomb United States or whatever.
It is there where Sanger and his future wife, Dr. Irene Brett, a brilliant mathematician, begin working on the Silbervogel. On paper, the aircraft is to be launched from a 2-mile-long sled track where rockets will push the Silverbird to over 5,000 feet in altitude.
The Germans decided to use this to put a little vehicle behind this Sanger ramjet bomber that was just tied to the sled, to the electronic sled, and it would push this Silverbird off into the air at a good clip.
He'd have a 2-mile-long monorail that would be pushed along by probably 2-3 dozen of Werner von Braun's V2 rocket engines. At the end of the monorail, the aircraft is going almost 1,200 miles an hour. Once it reached that speed, it would take off at about a 30-degree angle and go up to about 80 to 90 miles altitude.
When the aircraft's power plant ignites, over 600 tons of thrust is generated in a mere 11 seconds. Climbing to over 130,000 feet, the target for its 1-ton payload are the cities of New York and Washington, D.C. Traveling at hypersonic speed, no existing Allied plane or anti-aircraft artillery can touch this Silbervogel on its voyage halfway across the world. After releasing its bombs, this futuristic aircraft will hopefully land on either Japanese territory or on the deck of a U-boat submarine. It is a grand concept, a project that requires years, if not decades, of research and development and vast sums of money in order to complete. Ironically, one of the Silverbird's biggest flaws comes from Sanger himself.
He had a habit, when he ever come up against a problem which he couldn't solve immediately, he would move on to something else. So consequently, Sanger investigated a lot of things, but he jumped around. He jumped from one idea to another, to another, to another.
In studying its design, those in the top German hierarchy have many questions surrounding the aircraft's rocket engine.
With the Silverbird being rocket-powered, there's no plan B for it. Once you ignite the engine, it runs until it runs out of fuel. And you have to, it takes you wherever you have to go, and that's the end. With the supersonic transport, like the Concorde or the SST, I mean, you can turn, you can land, you can refuel, but you could not do that with Sanger Silverbird. And so, feasible, yes; practical, no.
Also, legitimate concerns are raised about the project's feasibility in a time of war.
The hypersonic vehicle requires an incredibly difficult exotic metal structure in order not to melt. And then you would have the trajectory problem of skipping off the atmosphere is difficult, not impossible, but very difficult. So essentially it was a completely utopian concept for the Third Reich.
This thing flies so high and so fast that how would you even drop the bomb knowing where to drop it and where it's going to hit? For example, the Silverbird, if it went around the world, and that's what it was designed to do, leave Berlin, fly around the world, and on the opposite pole would be New York City. You'd have to drop the bomb somewhere in Iowa. Iowa to New York City is a long, long distance.
He is a visionary, but not a practical man. While the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket are thoroughly tested on Peenemünde during the war years, the Silverbird is never able to get past the drawing board.
But it was all really fantastic futuristic ideas, which in today's world could be realized. But they were so far ahead of their time that Germany didn't have the capability in terms of facilities, equipment, the technology even was still only on the drawing board. And it would have taken a lot of experimentation to actually realize the ideas.
I mean, this was a paper proposal, and I think in so many of the enthusiast, Nazi exotic weapons concepts that the enthusiasts love, have failed to see just how beyond the technology of the time. I mean, it would be a difficult thing to carry out today, let alone in the 1940s.
By 1942, with the war going in Germany's favor, the Silbervogel is cancelled indefinitely. As the Third Reich faces attacks on two fronts, cuts need to be made, and an enormously expensive space plane is one of them.
Around 1941-42, the Luftwaffe lost interest in this whole utopian project of Zenger, because Zenger wanted to scale up his effort to build a major rocket engine and so forth for his airplane. And that was beyond the ability of the Luftwaffe to commit, especially as the war situation got more and more difficult. And there was essentially a contradiction between spending a lot of money on Zenger for rocket development when there was already a huge rocket project in Germany, the von Braun-Peenemünde project.
With the Silverbird's termination, Zenger and Brett are assigned to work on developing ramjet technology for the fatherland. The aircraft appears to be all but dead. 3 years after the project's cancellation, Germany surrenders to the Allies. With both sides closing in from the east and west, Nazi scientists who worked on the Third Reich's wonder weapons become highly sought-after bounty. In the United States, Operation Paperclip is enacted in order to bring these men to America to begin work in their own defense industries. The same people who developed the deadly V2 rocket that killed thousands during the Second World War now have their slate wiped clean as they begin their new lives, working for their one-time enemy. With tensions escalating as the Soviet Union becomes America's biggest adversary, they will need every advantage possible in order to defeat a regime that soon will possess both the atomic bomb and a delivery system capable of reaching the cities that Germany could never touch. Surprisingly, while hundreds of scientists are rounded up and sent to both sides of the Iron Curtain, Zenger and his wife, Irene Brett, go to neither superpower. Instead, they travel to France to restart their failed research.
Anybody who was picked up by the Soviets post-World War II, for example, if Zenger had been picked up by the Soviets, he had been squeezed like a lemon in order to get whatever knowledge and technology ideas he had out of him. He didn't want to go to the Soviet Union. Now, Zenger did not want to come to America in Operation Paperclip. In fact, he was never invited. Zenger was that small group of scientists in Nazi Germany who felt betrayed that the Americans had beat them, had defeated Nazi Germany, and that they were still mad, still angry with the Americans. And so Zenger, along with a few others, said, I'm not going to work for the Americans. I will not go to America. I'll go to France, where there's a more friendly work environment, and that's where I'm going to continue my career.
With the Soviet victory in 1945, its army begins capturing detailed blueprints of numerous German designs being worked on during the war.
When the Soviets overran Berlin, they overran the Reichsluftfahrtministerium building, and they copied every aircraft design that the Germans had proposed and were proposing to build post-World War II. They had all of these documents translated into Russian, so they knew every aircraft that Germany was working on or was thinking about in the future.
One plane in particular catches the eye of Joseph Stalin.
Stalin seized upon the idea about 1946-47 and was interested in funding it, and because it seemed like the magic answer to figuring out how to attack the United States.
The Soviets wanted Zenger. The Cold War was starting, and they thought, well, maybe one day we're going to have to bomb America, or maybe one day we'll have to bomb Australia. Maybe one day we'll have to bomb any other country around the world. Now, According to the documents that we have here, Sanger's suborbital rocket bomber could bomb any location in around the world. So they said, Stalin says, we got to find Sanger.
The Silver Bird, with all of its unique advantages on paper, appears to be an ideal weapon to use against the United States. And for that reason, he orders a Soviet espionage team headed personally by Stalin's son to kidnap Zanger and bring him to the Soviet Union. The attempt fails miserably.
Well, Sanger was tucked away in France, and although the silly Stalin could travel all over Europe, he was more of a playboy. He'd go to Paris, and he enjoyed the ladies of the night. He drank heavily, and so it got to the point where he was more interested in the cities he visited and the enjoyment he found than finding Sanger.
It is suspected that the communists lose interest in Zanger's ideas, as they discover in the same way that German scientists did that Zanger's plane is unachievable. On the other side of the world, where interest in spaceflight is reaching all-time highs, German scientist Walter Dornberger, who now is working for Bell Aircraft in Buffalo, New York, attempts to recruit Zanger, the same man who Dornberger criticized as a hopeless dreamer.
There was fascination in the United States with Zinger's Silverbird concept, hypersonic flight rocket planes in the 1950s specifically.
His crowning achievement can be seen in America's X-20 Dinosaur, incorporating a similar principle to that of his Silverbird design. A revolutionary spaceplane built during the Cold War, it is ultimately cancelled in 1963 due to both money and logistical problems. What becomes the beginning of the end for Iogan Zanger is his decision to go to work for Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Egyptians, developing missile technology. When it is discovered that an ex-Nazi is working for an Arab nation to defeat the Israelis, he is dealt a fatal blow to his career.
For a short time in the early 60s, he was kind of part of a scandal of, old Nazis and working on rockets for the Egyptians against the Israelis.
He was secretly working for Egyptian President Nasser, helping him design long-range missiles that could be fired at Israel. Well, the Israeli Secret Service found out about this, and Sanger's lucky he was never assassinated by these people because they were ruthless. Well, anyway, Sanger was alleged to be earning $500,000 a year from President Nasser. And word got back to German officials, and they didn't know what to do about it. Now, Germany at the time, West Germany, was seeking admission into NATO. And they didn't want any kind of conflict. They didn't want any kind of thing that was embarrassing. They wanted a smooth transition. So they decided that Sanger had to go.
Zanger would spend his final years in exile, dying in 1964.
I had talked with Sanger's son, Hartmut Sanger, several years ago, about this time when he was fired by the German government. Sanger lost all interest virtually in his work, didn't publish, didn't write, didn't speak. He ended up being a broken man, and Hartmut Sanger, his son, said that what had happened to him was the cause of his early death at 59 years of age.
In summing up the career of Iogan Zanger, one can describe him as a utopian visionary unable to turn his ideas into something concrete in the same way Wernher von Braun was able to do with the V2 rocket.
Well, Sanger is certainly an important visionary of the 1920s and 1930s, with some influence on future concepts for hypersonic flight on rocket airplanes, reentry technology. He has influence. He's not technologically, little of what he did actually played out in something familiar that actually got built.
His inability to see things through would relegate his career to that of a theoretician, unable to capture the headlines the same way his colleagues were able to. At the same time, his contribution to rocket technology, to ramjets, to the lifting body, to skip trajectory, and to hypersonic flight can never be ignored. Had his Silver Bird been completed, its impact would have been monumental to whatever country possessed the weapon. For that reason, Dr. Eoghan Zanger, one of Hitler's spacemen, is in the history books as one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century.
The origin of the Vigilante program can be loosely traced to an event that would become America's answer to Pearl Harbor. On the afternoon of April 18, 1942, Jimmy Doolittle and his crack volunteer group prepared to embark on a surprise attack on Tokyo. This was no ordinary air raid. The attack was to be carried out by 16 Army Air Corps bombers.
As the carrier plows through heavy seas, one bomber after another soars from the flight deck, pointed for Japan. The sea grows rougher, the weather worse, but not one plane fails to get into the air. Taking the gale in its teeth, each bomber sets its course for carefully prearranged military objectives in Japan.
Deployed from an unlikely airstrip, the USS Hornet, the events of that rainy afternoon were unprecedented, not only because of the unique inter-service cooperation, but it proved that a Navy carrier was an effective platform for long-range bombing. The American strategy was effective. Doolittle's raiders had dealt an important psychological blow to a seemingly invulnerable adversary. The role of the aircraft carrier in this attack would not be forgotten. Just 3 years later, American planes again dropped bombs on Japan. Only this time, the symbolism of the attack was overshadowed by the destructive power of the weapon used. The onset of a nuclear age brought with it a change in military thinking. Having delivered the final blow to Japan, the US Air Force assumed the mantle as a sole possessor of the nuclear endgame. As a post-war euphoria gave way to a Cold War reality, the Boeing B-47 and later Boeing B-52 Stratofortress were fit with the role of nuclear delivery. Long-range strategic bombing became a defensive priority. Now equipped with an aircraft that could reach the Soviet heartland from American bases, the aircraft carrier was deemed redundant. Struggling to find a role in the era of the strategic bomber, the Navy put forth a nuclear-capable aircraft of its own. The North American A.J. Savage was clearly the result of the desire for a nuclear bomber combined with an inherent distrust of pure jet aircraft. The two propulsion engines provided the security of low-speed carrier operations, while a single jet engine mounted in the center of the fuselage provided the speed, with two turning and one burning. The Savage was a clever hybrid. However, by the time it reached the carrier decks, it was already becoming obsolete. By 1949, the Douglas Company had begun developing its jet-powered follow-on, the A-3D Sky Warrior. When the Navy ordered the Douglas Sky Warrior in 1949, it was clear that pure jet propulsion was gaining thrust aboard carrier decks. Like most early nuclear bombers, the Sky Warrior was a massive plane. 76 feet in length and 72-foot wingspan made it the largest plane ever to be deployed from the deck of a carrier. However, like most early large jets, the Sky Warrior was relatively slow. Unable to reach supersonic speeds, it was deemed vulnerable to rapidly improving Soviet air defense. Because of its sheer size, the Sky Warrior was disliked by deck handlers. The absence of an ejection system was unsettling to its 3 crew members. In fact, many pilots joked that the 3D stood for all 3 dead. While the mammoth Sky Warrior assumed the more passive roles of electronic warfare and tanking, the Navy set out to find a nuclear bomber that would go faster than ever before. At the North American Aviation Plant in Columbus, Ohio, the challenge of creating a new nuclear bomber was given full priority. Headed by Frank Compton, the Columbus designers took the initiative in preempting the Navy's request for a new bomber. Beginning with sketches and slide rules, the small group delved enthusiastically into the uncharted waters of the aerodynamic unknown. By 1954, the implications of technological growth had a profound effect on the American bomber tactics. Advancements in radar-guided surface-to-air missiles had all but nullified the safety of high altitudes. With this in mind, the Navy conducted a secretive mission to explore the alternative to a high-altitude nuclear attack. On this mission, an A.J. Savage would take off from Spain, fly all the way to Paris, and back. Under the French radar, the plane was never detected. The implications of a low-altitude penetration for nuclear delivery were noticed by the engineers of Columbus. This low-altitude requirement was not incorporated into their initial design, which was dubbed the North American General Purpose Attack Weapon, or NAGPA.
We initially designed a low-altitude version with all of the systems in it, the inertial navigation, the automatic systems, we had the rocket engine in it, and all of those things, and we called that the NAGPA, and that was presented to the Navy in 1953. So the Navy studied it. It was our own unsolicited proposal, and they thought, well, that's a good idea to do all of those things, which we ended up doing in the Vigilante, but they said, how about making it supersonic? So we packed our bags and went home for about a year, and then came back with a supersonic version, which is the present-day Vigilante.
The North American design was dubbed the A3J. The intended role of the A3J was simple. It would penetrate the Soviet heartland, bringing with it a nuclear bomb. Its blazing speed would be the key to its survival. The quest for higher speeds resulted in an airframe like no other at the time. North American test pilot Ed Gillespie remembers his first impressions of the Vigilante.
In those days, we always felt if an airplane looked good, it was going to fly good. Well, the Vigilante certainly looked good. It looked like it was going Mach 2 when it was sitting on the deck. I couldn't believe that our engineering staff could stuff all the goodies in it that they finally did and still make the airplane carrier suitable or have the range of the legs that we finally ended up with. But it was such a good-looking airplane, and it still is to this day, that you just wanted it. It was a Cadillac of the fleet.
The Navy's requirements were stringent, to say the least. The Vigilante needed to be launched from a carrier with zero headwind, yet it also needed to cruise beyond Mach 2. Aerodynamically, this was a contradiction. The lift required for the carrier takeoff suggests the need for larger wings. However, larger wing areas prevent the plane from reaching high speeds. Engineers cope with this dilemma by making the wing much thinner than was generally accepted. It was argued by some that the aerodynamic compromises put forth in the Vigilante were drawbacks created by an overly stringent Navy. After all, since the aircraft carriers are generally moving, it would be extremely rare for a plane to be catapulted with zero headwind. This requirement was later relaxed, but not until after the engineering staff had taken extraordinary steps in making a flexible airframe that would revolutionize the way military aircraft are designed. While the Vigilante was taking shape, the Air Force was making progress on their own supersonic bomber programs. Aircraft evolution during the Cold War was rapid. The mighty B-52 was soon to be outperformed by the B-58 Hustler. The Hustler was not only supersonic, it could fly at Mach 2. However, just as the Hustler was entering service, the Air Force began the quest for even higher speeds. Here, at the North American Aviation Plant in Palmdale, California, a new airplane was taking shape. The B-70 Valkyrie promised to be the fastest bomber in the world. The Strategic Air Command was enamored by its potential. By 1964, they would have a bomber that would be impossible to catch. 9,000 miles away, the American bomber programs were already making an impression. The American pursuit of supersonic bombers posed a great challenge to the Soviet military. Soviet airspace was immense, and an unwelcome bomber could penetrate the vast areas between air bases guarding the border. If a Mach 2 bomber were to penetrate, it would be nearly impossible for even the fastest Soviet fighter of the time to catch it. Soviet aircraft design bureaus revolted into the task of creating the ultimate fighter, a plane that could catch and destroy America's fastest bomber. Back at the Columbus plant, the Vigilante was beginning to take shape. By 1958, it was clear that this plane was revolutionary. It was the first plane to fly by wire controls, the first to have a heads-up display, terrain avoidance, and a fully integrated inertial navigation, bombing, and electric warfare system. Advanced aluminum alloys were also introduced. However, of all the Vigilante's firsts, there is one that few people know about.
One of the things that we did in 1955 was look at the so-called stealth characteristics of the airplane, which now are high tech. And we checked the airplane. We built a range out here on the airfield where we could put a model and we could rotate the model. It was a copper screen model, and impinge radar signals onto it and measure the feedback. So we would rotate the model, and we'd actually design the airplane so that its radar reflectivity was concentrated at 2 points off of each side of the wingtips. And of course, when you're flying by something, why, you get a flash, but you don't get a large response. So we actually designed stealth into the Vigilante.
Back in Moscow, the design bureaus of MiG and Sukhoi were commissioned to develop an interceptor that could deal with the American threat. Despite differences in both culture and language between the United States and the Soviet Union, aerodynamics are universal. When different engineers independently strive for a similar requirement, their conclusions will also be similar. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that as early as 1958, the same year that the Vigilante first took to the air, Soviet engineers were filmed studying a model similar in design to that of the Vigilante. Despite the work done by Soviet designers on their own, it is likely that Columbus, Ohio frequently became the unofficial host of the KGB agents. It would be hard for them to miss the sleek American bomber sitting out on the tarmac.
They could have stood out here on the airport and taken pictures of it in 1958 when we made our first flight. There's really nothing covert about the Vigilante as far as its being there, and certainly the characteristics of it were secret. But the shape of it, looking at it, so I'm sure they had plenty of people, which they had all over the world, standing out here at Columbus, taking pictures of every airplane.
Nikolai Matchuk and Lev Shalengaya of the MiG Design Bureau were put in charge of the Soviet answer to the American bombers. An interceptor needs to be faster than the plane it chases. Therefore, MiG designers began the ambitious construction of a fighter that could push beyond Mach 3. This daunting task faced by the Soviets was aggravated by the progress being made back at the States. On the last day of August 1958, North American test pilot Dick Wenzel took to the air over Columbus. After the maiden flight, the Vigilante's prowess as a speedster began to truly shine. In June of 1960, famed aviatrix Jackie Cochran climbed into the back seat of the Vigilante, becoming the first woman to fly beyond Mach 2. Later that year, the Vigilante set yet another record when Commander Leroy Heath climbed to over 91,000 feet while carrying a 2,200-pound payload. Although the Navy was enamored by the Vigilante's performance, certain residents of the southeastern Ohio were less impressed.
We broke a lot of windows in the early days. One lady sued us because of the loss of her parrot, had a heart attack, I recall that. We also had a very definite problem with a gentleman down in southeastern Ohio who owned a dynamite factory, and it was right under our supersonic corridor. And he finally realized who was causing he was losing so many man hours to people bailing out the windows and so on when we would shock his employees that he finally got in touch with us and said, please, I think it's you guys, don't do it anymore. And indeed, we did move our corridor away from him, and he thanked us. He wasn't losing the time anymore.
To a pilot flying a new plane, the ejection seat is the most important piece of equipment on board. Bucking the trend toward the British Martin Baker variety, North American designed its own. And in fact, came up with the first seat to safety eject the pilot both above and below the speed of sound. A Navy pilot is not necessarily in the air when he needs to get out of the plane. In the dangerous world of carrier operations, escaping from a submerged plane can be the key to survival. Dramatic footage shows both crew members successfully ejecting at zero altitude, however the system was not error-free.
One time, I was flying at 42,000 feet on a first production flight, and a misrigged canopy, and this is the only time it ever happened, I might add, suddenly blew off. I lost my canopy at 42,000 feet at 1.42 Mach. And of course, it was stunned me. It just explosive decompression. I was alone. Explosive decompression. And when I realized, I thought I had ejected. But seconds later, I realized I hadn't. I throttled back, speed brakes out. My visor was down fully. My mask was on very tight. Of course, explosive decompression kicked it out. But when I finally got out of control, I realized it was still in the airplane, and the airplane was unhurt, except that I was open cockpit. So therefore, I claim, and nobody's ever I don't believe that anybody's ever come close, but we have the fastest open cockpit flying record.
At the beginning of 1961, 2 vigilantes were moved from Columbus, Ohio to Kirtland Air Force Base to begin the program's most difficult and complex series of tests, bomb delivery. The method employed to release a bomb remains perhaps the most bizarre chapter in the vigilante story. Instead of dropping bombs like a conventional bomber, the bomb was ejected straight out through an opening in the tail of the plane. In the early 50s, high and fast were the most important elements in a bombing attack. However, with improvements in air defense systems, it became apparent that sneaking under the radar was the safer bet. For pilots carrying a nuclear bomb, this meant learning some extraordinary tactics.
Our initial method was to fly the airplane straight and level at Mach 2 at 70,000 feet and drop the bomb out of the back of the airplane. As it would come out, the tail cone would come off the airplane, the bomb would come out like this and then go. And of course, the airplane was at 70,000 feet there, so there wasn't an escape problem up there. Later on, of course, then we also decided that we could come in low, right on the deck, and pitch and automatically or manually program the airplane up and to about a 40-degree attitude where the bomb would then come out. And as the airplane continued, the bomb would come off and go towards the target. The airplane would then continue around and do an Immelman turn and then go the other way and escape. The other way was an over-the-shoulder where you hit the target, you were right over the target. This was your IP, or your initial point. You pull up right there and right over the target, you released the bomb, you continued around like this. The bomb would go straight up and come straight down, and luckily by the time it hit you, you were off and away.
For pilots, these hair-raising maneuvers were taxing enough without having to worry about finding and hitting the target. This was a job for the Radar Attack Navigator, or RAN, who sat in the back seat. Responsible for target and checkpoint acquisition, terrain avoidance, and a host of other duties, the RAN is crucial to the mission.
the fact that the RAN, or the radar attack navigator, was in a compartment completely isolated behind the pilot with no front view meant that you had to work very hard at coordinating the mission, getting your cockpit-to-cockpit chatter down to where it was both brief but informative. And as the navigator in the back would run sensors, navigate the airplane, the pilot in front is looking for visual cues and maneuvering the target in the end game. It was a wonderful experience to form the teaming that you saw between pilots and navigators.
Before each mission, the RAN sets the course the pilot will follow en route to the target. Flying below radar means that mountains are as dangerous as the enemy defenses. This is especially true at night or in poor weather. Former vigilante pilot Captain Joe Dyer is well aware of the importance of the man who sat behind him.
Well, I think the RAN that is responsible for me being here today was made up for one of those lapses in attention. I was a young aviator. We were flying low altitude and high speed, and after a few hundred hours, you got too comfortable at doing that. And I was looking down at a chart or my kneeboard card. The nose of the airplane dipped a little bit. The guy in the back seat says, "Hey, Joe, watch your attitude." I looked down 50 feet. Recovered, nighttime, by the way. I gently recovered. Didn't say anything about it, but my knees were knocking in the front. And I remember thinking as we turned to the next target and the navigator was talking to me, "Gosh, you ought to be quiet. You know, you're almost dead back there."
During an attack, checkpoints such as islands or mountains were displayed on a television system. Such checkpoints were used to ensure the pilot was keeping true to course. Because onboard radar defeats the purpose of trying to remain invisible, the navigator was given a state-of-the-art interior navigation system that provided him an accurate reading of his location, without betraying his position. To ensure that the plane was keeping true to its course, the navigator would occasionally flash his radar to verify checkpoints and correct any navigational error. Should enemy interceptors pick up the radar flashes, an electronic countermeasure indicator will warn the pilot of incoming fighters. It will then confuse enemy radar by emitting false information concerning the whereabouts of the vigilante. Back in Moscow, the new Soviet interceptor had moved from the drawing board to tarmac.
6th of March 1964, Mikoyan Design Bureau test pilot Alexander Fedotov makes the maiden flight of the 155R1. I remember that day very well. We had a potential accident during that maiden flight. It was quite cold, about minus 12 degrees Celsius. Earlier, we'd installed sensors on the aircraft to test the flight systems in flight. We had a remote health checking system in the sensors, and soon after takeoff, I got a warning indication that the fuel pumps weren't working. Afterwards, it appeared that an important fuel agent hadn't been added to the aircraft tanks. It was a sort of antifreeze for kerosene. As you know, kerosene contains water, and during the flight, the water froze in the pumps. Luckily, Fedotov managed to turn back to the aerodrome and land. He was very lucky to have had enough available fuel to get back. If the flight had been longer, the engines would have been shut down.
Its similarity to the Vigilante is obvious, the major difference being in the large twin vertical fins. MiG designers had less success than their American counterparts when it came to dealing with high-speed stability. This problem would plague the Russians for years to come. Back in Columbus, the Vigilante's problems were political, not aerodynamic. The Air Force had long argued that the strategic attack role was exclusively an Air Force mission. The Navy disagreed. By 1960, discourse over the Navy's role in the strategic mission had snowballed into the bitter inter-service, rivalry, and debate. The Vigilante was a casualty.
The Air Force convinced Congress that the Navy shouldn't have a strategic mission, and so we converted the airplane from a 70,000-foot Mach 2 airplane very successfully to a low-altitude, long-range reconnaissance airplane.
Enter the RA-5, R being reconnaissance. The shift from attack to reconnaissance took place just as the Vigilante was entering service with the Navy. The first Vigilantes were delivered to Naval Air Station Sanford in Florida in 1961. By January of the following year, they entered squadron service. During this period, the heated debate over whether the Navy should have a role in the nuclear deterrent cast a shadow on the Vigilantes' long-awaited arrival into fleet service. Anticipating that the Air Force would get its way, the Navy recognized its potential in a very different role. The Vigilante was well suited for the role of aerial reconnaissance. Fully loaded with cameras, the recon pilot's only defense is speed. Capable of blazing beyond Mach 2, the Vigilante was clearly fast enough for the job. However, even more important than speed was the fact that it could be launched from a carrier. Unrestricted by the diplomatic and logistical problems encountered when operating from foreign airfields, the Vigilante gave naval intelligence an eye in all corners around the world.
This airplane carried fixed focal length cameras from 3 inches out to 12 inches, had an 18-inch panoramic camera that would let you stand miles offshore but still get excellent photography of areas of interest. It was also an all-weather machine because it had in that canoe underneath the airplane a side-looking radar or an image-forming radar that would go through clouds that would bring back image quality or reconnaissance quality photography. The 18-inch pan camera would give you wonderful standoff, almost the quality of today's space cameras, in that you could read a license plate in downtown, probably still classified cities, coastal cities at great distance.
In 1964, the first reconnaissance Vigilantes joined the fleet. During this period, the Cold War was again heating up, and there was no shortage of areas upon which the government wanted to keep a close eye on. When the Vigilante returned to the ship, intelligence information recorded on tape and film are rushed into a highly specialized group of rooms several floors below the flight deck. This area, known as the Integrated Operational Intelligence Center, is where all the processing and interpretation takes place. The Vigilante pilots had 3 basic ways of gathering intelligence. One was to fly at very high altitudes to get a picture of activity deep within enemy territory. Another way was to briefly sneak across the beach very low to obtain a detailed picture of enemy defenses several miles inland. The third was a short-range beach reconnaissance to give details of possible landing assault. All of the sensory data, whether optical or non-optical, was correlated and analyzed in conjunction with each other to provide an integrated analysis of the hostile military activity. Such intelligence is then passed on to the air wing. From this information, tactical mission planning or orders of battle can be prepared and effectively carried out. If an airstrike is called for, the attacking planes will know exactly which targets to attack and which radar signature to jam.
273 miles, approaching glide path.
The information provided by the Vigilante is tactical, meaning that it gives a continuous and updated picture of the enemy during a wartime situation. Tactical recon was nothing new to the US Navy. During World War II, Navy Wildcats were fit to carry large cameras. Stationed at forward bases in the South Pacific, photo pilots flew over Japanese Hell Islands before an amphibious assault. Navy bomber pilots studied the photographs and picked their targets before setting on their way. During the Korean War, aerial reconnaissance missions were being flown off the decks of carriers. Photographic versions of the Grumman F-9F Panther brought back detailed pictures of Kim Il-sung's task forces, supply depots, anti-aircraft batteries, and troop concentrations. Later in the war, these same cameras would photograph large-scale troop buildups in the north. Troops that were discovered to be Chinese. From before the Incheon landing and through to the end of hostilities, photographic intelligence proved to be a decisive factor. The prevailing notion that the atomic bomb would deter any future conflicts had been proven false. The carrier emerged once again as the long arm of the US military, and reconnaissance planes became the eye of the fleet. Following the Korean War, US foreign policy was directed to another area of the world, the Middle East. In July of 1958, civil unrest in Lebanon threatened the already precarious political standing in the region. Also, some 2,500 Americans were living in and around the Beirut area. In preparation for an amphibious landing, photographic versions of the F-9F Cougar took over the skies of Lebanon, bringing back detailed pictures of troop buildups along the Damascus Road leading from Syria. These pictures were then used to determine exactly where the Marines should come ashore. While Navy planes were busy with tactical reconnaissance, the Air Force was keeping an eye on the US military's main area of interest, the Soviet Union. On May 1, 1960, a Lockheed U-2 took off from Pakistan on a high-altitude recon mission that would dramatically change the defense relationships between the United States and the Soviet Union. The U-2, flown alone by France's Gary Powers, never made it to Norway. On May 5th, Nikita Khrushchev announced that Powers' U-2 had been brought down 1,400 miles inside Soviet territory. Khrushchev charged America with deliberate aggression and stated that the world could be pushed to the brink of war. The ill-fated spy flight was a diplomatic disaster for the Eisenhower administration. For the State Department, it meant apologies and damage control. For the Pentagon, however, it revealed the need for a faster spy plane. When the Central Intelligence Agency was in charge of strategic reconnaissance missions, the Vigilante was being readied for the entrance into the fleet. Its prowess in the areas of speed and altitude had not gone unnoticed by the CIA. After all, the plane had been initially designed to penetrate Soviet airspace with a nuclear bomb on board. If it could penetrate Soviet airspace with a nuclear bomb, it could certainly do so with cameras. New engines specifically designed to sustain the plane at a high-altitude supersonic dash were considered by both the Navy and the CIA. However, as the CIA project was still in the planning stages, a conflict in a different part of the world was beginning to boil.
Destroyer was carrying out a mission of patrol in those waters, in international waters. When it was attacked, it replied to the attack, continued to carry out its mission today, and will do so the remainder of this week in the same waters. The President has asked the destroyer force be doubled with an aircraft, a combat air patrol, be available at all times on call to it. And as I think you know, he's issued instructions that in the event of a further attack upon our vessels in international waters, we are to respond with the objective of destroying the attackers.
On August 5, 1964, the Vietnam War unofficially began. Airstrikes targeted North Vietnamese fuel deposits, suspected military installations, bridges, and roadways. However, there was one major problem. Maps of North Vietnam were notoriously inaccurate. In some instances, these maps were as much as 4 miles in error. The problem this presented to American pilots is obvious. On the ground, American troops were forced to adapt to the guerrilla tactics they faced in both jungles and towns. From the day the first American soldiers set foot in Vietnam, it was clear that fighting such an elusive enemy would prove difficult. A decade of war had left the North Vietnamese well adapted to an ambush style of warfare. Inaccurate maps aggravated the problem for American soldiers. Errors up to 4 miles created confusion about the location of crucial landmarks like hills, rivers, and villages. Precision is imperative in close air support. With absolutely no room for error, the need for accurate maps was never more clear. The vigilante pilots entered the war in late 1964 aboard the USS Ranger. Shortly thereafter, additional vigilante squadrons joined the combat area aboard the USS Kitty Hawk, Enterprise Forrestal, Constellation, and America. The first task of the vigilante crews was to solve the problem of poor intelligence and inaccurate maps. In just a 2-week period, the vigilante collected the imagery of the entire Vietnamese area, providing the US military with reliable maps for the first time. However, what the maps did not show was the complex network of trails and bridges upon which the North Vietnamese funneled supplies to the south. The Ho Chi Minh Trail frustrated the American military. Cutting off this relentless flow of supplies became a priority. However, finding it was a different story. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not one trail, but a vast network of trails. Complicating this was the fact that most of these trails were shrouded in a thick jungle canopy. Despite this, US warplanes took aim at whatever appeared to be part of this vast supply route. As the war progressed, the Ho Chi Minh Trail would become the focus of the most concentrated bombing campaigns of the entire war. Despite the onslaught of bombs, supplies continued to pour into the south. In an attempt to reveal North Vietnamese supply routes, American planes began dumping massive amounts of what was then deemed to be non-toxic defoliant. The use of Agent Orange proved difficult and ineffective. A much cleaner way of looking within the jungle canopy was carried out by the vigilante. The infrared sensors aboard the plane could pick up heat energy from trucks or other activity in the trail. In the first months of the war, the vigilante had earned a reputation as an exceptional recon plane. However, it had also established a less flattering reputation. Because of its sheer size and high landing speed, the vigilante was notoriously difficult to bring aboard a carrier.
The vigilante community was made up of outstanding aviators, but that's because we very quickly weeded out those that had trouble at the carrier. The carrier, to this day, is the most demanding aspect of naval aviation, and that's where vigilante pilots, the successful ones, absolutely excelled.
By the cessation of bombing in 1968, the Rolling Thunder policies had transformed many areas of North Vietnam into a decimated moonscape. But the North Vietnamese proved resilient, as rebuilding commenced immediately when the planes disappeared. Working in conjunction with American bombers became the primary role of vigilante crews. Before an attack, vigilante pilots would fly over a likely North Vietnamese target. After the bombing run, the vigilante would again fly over the target to assess the damage. Because he enjoyed the element of surprise, the vigilante pilot usually encountered little resistance before an attack. However, the post-strike flyover was a different matter.
Some of the airplanes in Vietnam were lost because the their tactics were to follow up a bomb delivery mission with reconnaissance, and pretty soon the Vietnamese were smart and they knew that after they got a few bombs, they were also going to get a vigilante.
After a massive bombing raid, North Vietnamese gunners were ready at the trigger. In the north, anti-aircraft defenses were formidable. The sound of an American plane would cause the sky to erupt into a violent hail of artillery. The policy of post-strike reconnaissance proved costly. In fact, more vigilantes were lost over Vietnam than any other Navy plane during the war. 11 of the 18 airplanes lost were attributed to anti-aircraft artillery. Proof that when flying at low levels, even the fastest and most sophisticated airplane is vulnerable to the oldest form of anti-aircraft defense. The pieces of the airplanes seen on the boat are from a vigilante that left the USS Kitty Hawk on its last mission. May 19, 1967. Vigilantes were flown off the decks of carriers up until the ceasefire in 1973. Designed to fly against the best Soviets had to offer, the Vigilante spent most of its career flying against a more ambiguous enemy over the skies of Southeast Asia. For American pilots, this was typical Cold War reality. During the brush fires and wars of containment that characterized the Cold War, the aircraft carrier was the strong arm of American foreign policy. For almost 20 years, the Vigilante was the eye of the fleet. And during this tenure, the Vigilante community developed a distinguished reputation.
The vigilante community really was just that. It was a small group of about a dozen fleet squadrons, one replacement air group, which serviced both East Coast and West Coast ships out of, first of all, Sanford, Florida. Then we moved up to Albany, Georgia, and finally down in Key West, where we finally wrapped up the show. But it was a small community in that everyone knew everybody, and we had our full collection of characters. We probably had a resident village idiot or two. We had bears with sore heads, but far and away, the community was made up of very, very professional people that epitomized what in the aviation business we call crew coordination.
In 1979, the Vigilante retired from service with the Navy. Without question, it was the most effective and successful reconnaissance airplane ever to operate off the deck of a carrier. Even by standards extent, nearly 2 decades after its heyday, the Vigilante's level of performance remains extraordinary. The technological and mechanical sophistication introduced by its designers have left a distinct impression on modern aviation. One of the Vigilante's major design firsts were its horizontal ramp intakes for its engines. Such intakes are now commonplace on military planes. One look at the Navy's F-14 Tomcat reveals how much was borrowed from the sleek design of the Vigilante. The Air Force's mighty F-15 Eagle has also borrowed heavily from the four-sided Vigilante designers. But whatever became of the once feared Soviet MiG-25, the Foxbat?
About a year ago, there was a picture of a Foxbat reconnaissance version. And of course, the Foxbat looks very much like the Vigilante, and it also has the same canoe on the bottom of it and so forth that our RA-5C had. So I think today they are continuing to have a reconnaissance system, which we no longer have.
The MiG-25 had a fate similar to the Vigilante. When it emerged, it was deemed one of the fastest and most daunting aircraft in the world. However, like the Vigilante, it was used most effectively when carrying cameras rather than bombs or missiles. When the Vigilante retired, with it went the Navy's ability to take an integrated picture of the battlefield. During Operation Desert Storm, it would be satellites, not airplanes, that kept an eye on the movements of Iraqi troops and Scuds. However, satellites have their drawbacks.
Desert Storm, one of the big lessons learned, quote, was tactical reconnaissance. And they still in Desert Storm had to try to get satellite data to Washington and back to Desert Storm, which was a day later instead of an hour later. Satellite has a little problem getting electronic intelligence because it only goes over once every hour and a half, you know. We can be there continuously and know exactly where we are.
With the end of the Cold War, there are now signs that dedicated tactical reconnaissance may be re-emerging as a defense priority. In the tradition of the vigilante, an unmanned reconnaissance system currently under development promises to give the battlefield commanders an eye in the sky. The Handley Page Victor completed the RAF's V-bomber triangle with the Vickers Valiant and Avro Vulcan, forming the British Strategic Nuclear Strike Force during the Cold War. Though it never saw combat, the Victor played a vital role as an aerial tanker for the Royal Air Force in later years. Known for its elegant and streamlined design, it stood apart from its contemporaries with its distinctive appearance. By the end of World War II, strategic bombing had come into its own as one of the main weapons for waging modern warfare. Already, controversies had started about both the efficiency and the morality of such a method of fighting. But the 2 atomic bomb attacks against Japan in 1945 had demonstrated the awesome power now available to strategic bombers armed with this new type of weapon. Once the war had ended, the Allied powers were only too ready to begin reducing their armed forces and military spending, and to set about rebuilding their countries and economies which had suffered severely from the years of conflict. However, astute observers could see that the world had changed, and that the war had created a shift in political power on a global scale. Even before the war ended, Joseph Stalin had decided that the USSR was to become a world power to be reckoned with, and an equal of the USA. Accordingly, by 1945, work was well underway to produce a Soviet strategic bomber force as quickly as possible, so that the Western Allies would understand that in the post-war world, the USSR had no intention of being dictated to by anyone. One way of building up such a force was to copy proven Western designs, and at the time, the airplane judged to be the foremost strategic bomber was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the type which carried out the atomic bomb attacks against Japan. Already, the Soviets had been able to examine examples of this type which had been forced to divert to the USSR during the war, so it was relatively a simple task to copy the design and to put it into production for the Soviet Air Force until such a time as Soviet-designed bombers became available. Great priority was also given to developing atomic weapons, because these had been demonstrated as being the weapons of the future, and it was unthinkable that the USA should be left as the sole power in possession of such an arsenal. It was not very long before tension began to grow between the USSR and the West. Then, once the Iron Curtain had come down across Europe, the Cold War arms race began in earnest. Both sides were able to use the significant technological advances made during the war to develop a new generation of jet-powered fighter and bomber aircraft that would soon render even the most sophisticated piston engine designs obsolete. Military planners continued with the wartime strategic bombing philosophy, but the advent of the jet age meant that the bombers would now have to fly higher and faster than ever before in order to remain beyond the reach of jet fighters which would be opposing them. Initially, the bombers would have the advantage because they were multi-engined and able to carry more fuel than the fighters, but this advantage could not be relied upon indefinitely. During the late 1940s, however, it was a prime consideration when planners on both sides of the Iron Curtains were formulating their plans. Because RAF Bomber Command had been so heavily involved in the increasingly ferocious air offensive against Germany, it had proved impractical to divert resources to the design of a jet-powered bomber whilst the war continued, and, consequently, bomber development concentrated largely upon improving the existing Avro Lancaster. However, jet fighter design was actively pursued in Britain, where by the end of the fighting, both the Gloucester Meteor and the de Havilland Vampire were in frontline service, and the British jet engines were arguably second to none. With the war over, the new Labour government decided that despite the drastic reduction in the size of Britain's armed forces, they would nevertheless have to have modern jet-powered airplanes. And as the international situation deteriorated, the need for such aircraft became increasingly urgent. Specification B/45 was issued in 1945 for a twin-engine jet bomber to replace the de Havilland Mosquito, and from the designs submitted prototypes were ordered from English Electric, which would eventually become the Canberra Tactical Bomber. In 1947, however, the decision was taken that Britain would produce her own atomic bomb, and as the only viable means of delivering it would be by a bomber aircraft, then these would also be British of design. One company which had embarked upon such private and highly secret work was Handley Page, which had a significant stake in the wartime bomber offensive with its Hampton and Halifax aircraft. As early as June 1945, Handley Page had begun studies on two swept-wing jet bomber designs, one powered by 4 engines with an all-up weight of 100,000 pounds, and the other powered by 2 engines with a weight of 60,000 pounds. The larger of these was studied in 2 versions, each of which was given a cover designation to hide the true nature of the project. One was the tailless HP-75A, with engines carried in the wing roots and a canard tailplane either side of the nose. This took its designation from the HP-75 Monk's tailless research aircraft and was soon abandoned in favor of the other version, the HP-72A, which was so designated to suggest it was a variant of the HP-72 heavy transport. In March 1946, this design was approved by the company which formally gave it the type number HP-80, and was submitted to the MOS for consideration primarily as a strategic bomber, but also as a possible military or civil freighter or as an airliner. Following final approval of the HP-80 design by the MOS, an order for 2 prototypes was placed on the 28th of April 1948, for which the serial numbers WB771 and WB775 were reserved. Aviation author Bill Gunston described the Victor's compound sweep crescent wings as having been undoubtedly the most efficient, high subsonic wing on any drawing board in 1947. The wing sweep and chord underwent 3 distinct reductions from the root to the tip, ensuring a consistent critical Mach number along the entire wing and consequently enabling a high cruise speed. Likewise, the nose and tail sections, responsible for accelerating the flow, were meticulously designed to match the critical Mach number, resulting in a consistent critical Mach number throughout the entire shape of the HP-80 aircraft. Initially, the project explores tailless aircraft designs that would rely on wingtip vertical surfaces. However, as the proposal evolved, the decision was made to adopt a high-mounted, full tailplane instead. The profile and shaping of the crescent wing underwent extensive refinement and alterations during the early development stages, primarily to address unfavorable pitching behavior during flight. The HP-80 and Avros Type 698 were chosen as the best 2 of the proposed designs to B-35/46, and orders for 2 prototypes of each were placed. It was recognized, however, that there were many unknowns associated with both designs, and an order was also placed for Vickers' design, which became the Valiant. Although not fully meeting the requirements of the specification, the Valiant's design proposed little risk of failure, and could therefore reach service earlier. 2 HP-80 prototypes, WB771 and WB775, were built. Sections of the aircraft were hidden under wood framing and tarpaulins, printed with Gelafandi, Southampton, to make it appear as a boat hull in transit. Gelafandi was an anagram of Handley Page, marred by a songwriter's error. On the 24th of December 1952, piloted by Handley Page's chief test pilot Hedley Hazeldine, WB771 made its maiden flight, which lasted for a total of 17 minutes. 10 days later, the Air Ministry announced the aircraft's official name to be Victor. The prototypes performed well. However, design failings led to the loss of WB771 on the 14th of July 1954, when the tailplane detached whilst making a low-level pass over the runway at Cranfield, causing the aircraft to crash with the loss of the crew. Production Victors had a lengthened nose to move the crew escape door further from the engine intakes, as the original position was considered too dangerous as an emergency exit in flight. The lengthened nose also improved the center of gravity range. The Victor was a sleek aircraft with 4 turbojet and later turbofan engines in its thick wing roots. It had distinctive features like a high-swept T-tail with considerable dihedral on the tailplanes, and a chin bulge housing the targeting radar, nose landing gear unit, and an auxiliary bomb aimer's position. Originally, the nose section was designed as an escape pod but was later abandoned. The crew consisted of 2 pilots seated side by side, and 3 rear-facing members, the navigator/plotter, navigator/radar operator, and air electronics officer. Only the pilots had ejection seats, while the others relied on inflatable cushions for emergency situations. For nuclear delivery, the Victor sported an all-over anti-flash white color scheme to protect against nuclear detonation effects. Later, when assigned to low-level approaches, they were repainted in green and gray tactical camouflage to reduce visibility, a scheme also applied to converted tanker aircraft. The Victor had a large bomb bay compared to the Valiant and Vulcan, enabling heavier weapon loads but at a cost of range. It could carry various conventional armaments, including a 22,000-pound Grand Slam or two 12,000-pound tallboy bombs, up to 48 1,000-pound bombs or 39 2,000-pound sea mines. Underwing panniers for additional bombs were considered but not pursued. The Victor utilized the navigational and bombing systems, along with radar systems like H-2S and Green Satin. The bomb aiming system's accuracy was around 400 yards, sufficient for high-level nuclear strike operations. The Victor was praised for its excellent handling and performance, displaying smooth flight characteristics even at low speeds. Its aerodynamic performance during test flights was impressive, flying up to Mach 0.98 without any issues. The aircraft's narrowness and inflexible crescent wing contributed to its comfortable low-altitude flight. An unusual characteristic was its self-landing capability, with a natural flare during ground effect, resulting in a cushioned landing without pilot intervention. While considered agile for a large bomber, it could perform maneuvers like loops and barrel rolls. The Victor was designed for high subsonic speeds, but it also broke the sound barrier on occasion. Production B-1 Victors were equipped with Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire ASSA-7 turbojets, rated at 11,000 pounds of force. Initially armed with the Blue Danube nuclear weapon, they later switched to the more powerful Yellow Sun weapon. Additionally, Victors carried US-owned Mark V nuclear bombs via Project E, and the British Redbeard tactical nuclear weapon. Some were upgraded to B-1A standard with the enhanced radar and countermeasures. On June 1, 1956, a Victor flown by test pilot Johnny Allen unintentionally broke the sound barrier, maintaining stability throughout the event. Some claim that Allen did it intentionally to showcase the Victor's higher speed capability compared to the earlier V-bombers. At that time, the Victor was the largest aircraft to have broken the sound barrier. The RAF sought improved Victors with higher operational ceilings, leading to various proposals. Handley Page initially suggested a Phase 2 bomber with 14,000 pounds of force Sapphire 9 engines and a subsequent Phase 3 version with a longer wingspan and different engines. However, these plans faced delays and modifications. The Phase 2A proposal became the Victor B-2, powered by Conway RCO-11 engines with 17,250 pounds of thrust was proposed. The wingspan was increased to 120 feet, and additional features like elephant ear intakes were added for safety. The first flight of the Victor B-2 prototype occurred on the 20th of February, 1959. Unfortunately, during high-altitude engine tests, the prototype crashed into the sea due to a pilot head failure, leading to design adjustments. The B-2 entered service in February 1962. 9 B-2 aircraft were converted for strategic reconnaissance, known as the Victor SR-2, replacing Valiants. They were equipped with various cameras and air sampling equipment to detect nuclear testing particles, making them highly capable reconnaissance assets. Before the Valiant was retired as a tanker, trials were conducted using the Victor, equipping it with refueling equipment such as bomb bay tanks, underwing tanks, refueling probe, and de Havilland Spectre-assisted takeoff units. The aircraft involved in the trials demonstrated successful refueling capabilities at high weights and short takeoff distances. After the Valiant's withdrawal due to metal fatigue in 1964, the RAF lacked flight refueling capability. Surplus B-1 and B-1A aircraft were converted for tanker duty. 14 B-1A and 11 B-1 aircraft were fitted with fuel tanks in the bomb bay and a high-capacity centerline hose dispenser, becoming K-1A and K-1 tankers, respectively. 24 B-2s were converted to K-2 standard, serving as tankers until their withdrawal in October 1993. The Victor entered service with deliveries to No. 232 Operational Conversion Unit RAF in late 1957. During times of high tension, V-bombers, including the Victor, would disperse and maintain high readiness. If ordered for a nuclear strike, Victors could be airborne in under 4 minutes. To avoid detection, carefully planned routes exploiting weaknesses in the Soviet radar network were followed, along with extensive onboard ECM for increased evasion chances. During the Falklands War in 1982, both Victor and Vulcan played crucial roles. The Vulcan needed multiple refuelings from Victor tankers to cross the South Atlantic for bombing missions. The Victor tanker fleet supported other assets like the Hawker Siddeley Nimrod and Lockheed Hercules deployed to the theater. The Victor was often deployed overseas temporarily for ceremonial training and exercise purposes. The remaining Victor fleet was retired in 1993, at which point it had been the last of the 3 V-bombers in operational service. The final point of the V-bomber triangle, as rough of a development period as it was, proved to be a pinnacle of the British Cold War bomber design. The aircraft exhibited much of what made it unique in terms of both form and function, and provided the RAF with a long-range, high-flying, heavy hitter that made the world notice. Advancements by adversaries on the ground eventually changed the intended role. Some, in time altogether, removed her as a potential player in future roles. At the very least, the Victor proved to be something of a special plane, providing a futuristic style to design a complementary capability that made her a powerful factor in the English strategic nuclear air arm.
By 1964, Britain's nuclear V-force was at its operational peak. If required, over 150 Valiants, Victors and Vulcans could be scrambled from temporary airfields all over the British Isles. The aircraft could be airborne within 4 minutes. Armed with a blue steel nuclear missile, a lone aircraft had the capability to strike a mortal blow deep in the heart of Soviet Russia. This was the era of the QRA, Quick Reaction Alert. Royal Air Force Bomber Command reached its zenith in size and power during the last months of the Second World War. Night after night, hundreds of Lancasters and Halifax heavy bombers were sent to bludgeon the German homeland with millions of tons of bombs. Working in conjunction with the US Air Force, the Allied bomber formations laid waste to industrial, civilian, and military centers, playing a significant part in the eventual victory in Europe. But the cost was high. Despite being heavily armored and equipped with defensive weapons, the heavy bombers remained vulnerable. In contrast, the de Havilland Mosquito had shown remarkably high rates of survivability, despite being totally unarmed. The key lay in its ability to fly at high speed at altitudes that put it beyond the German defenses. In 1945, as the Allies swept across Western Europe and into Germany, many aircraft research establishments were overrun. American, British, and Russian scientists would all benefit enormously from the data captured from the Germans, who had explored every aspect of aeronautical design. Of particular interest were the advances in turbojet and wing technology. The Messerschmitt 262 had been the world's first jet bomber, even though it was designed as a fighter. It proved to be totally unsuited to the bombing role, as it simply could not carry sufficient payload to cause serious damage. But as a fighter, it could outfly any aircraft operated by the Allied air forces. Swept wings and centrifugal flow jet engines like those on the 262 would become standard features for years to come. The Germans had also explored the properties of the delta wing with the Messerschmitt 163 Comet interceptor. These and other aircraft, like the Arado 234, all signaled that aircraft design was about to enter a new era. Meanwhile, the war in the Far East was at risk of grinding towards a stalemate. Despite the imminent invasion of their own homeland, the Japanese simply would not give up, even resorting to suicide attacks against the American ships. Then, on the 6th of August, 1945, a lone Boeing B-29 Superfortress flying at 32,000 feet dropped an atomic bomb over Hiroshima in Japan. The device was a free-fall bomb timed to detonate at 1,900 feet above ground level, with a power equivalent to 12,500 tons of TNT. 3 days later, a second bomb, with the power equivalent to 22,000 tons of TNT, was dropped on Nagasaki. Japan quickly surrendered, and the Second World War was over. In an instant, the old arguments about who or what constituted strategic might became blindingly obvious. The nuclear bomb. With the coming of peace came the inevitable cutbacks in military spending, despite a mistrust of Soviet intentions in Europe and the Far East. Demobilization provided a natural means of reducing numbers of RAF personnel, but other cutbacks would hurt much more. Production contracts and, in particular, aeronautic research projects were either drastically cut back or cancelled. The lead in aeronautics and aero-engine design that Britain enjoyed at the end of the war was all but wiped out within a year. For Bomber Command, this meant that the Avro Lincoln, which had replaced the Lancaster, would have to soldier on into the 1950s. But the Lincoln belonged to a bygone era. Not only was it slow compared to the new jet bombers that were on the way, it had limited range and, most importantly, was unable to carry a nuclear bomb. As a solution to this last problem, Bomber Command was to be equipped with Boeing B-29s leased from the Americans. Whilst it was undoubtedly capable of carrying an atom bomb, it was still a Second World War bomber, and not the kind of aircraft the RAF needed to take it into the nuclear era. However, there was some light in an otherwise gloomy picture. The RAF had been the first Allied Air Force to fly a jet-powered aircraft, the Gloucester Meteor. Although the performance of the early Meteors was disappointing, it provided the RAF with much valuable experience in jet flight. The Air Ministry was determined to have a jet bomber in service as early as possible. Even before the end of the war, a new specification was issued for a light bomber powered by twin jet engines intended as a replacement for the Mosquito. The result was the English Electric Canberra, which would go on to serve the RAF and US Air Force for over 40 years. Although a relatively conventional design with thick, unswept wings, it could still fly at a speed and altitude beyond the reach of the jet fighters of the day. But it could only carry 6,000 pounds of bombs, and Bomber Command needed an aircraft capable of carrying a nuclear weapon weighing 10,000 pounds. And so in January 1947, further specifications were issued calling for aircraft capable of penetrating enemy defenses at high altitude, evading interception by means of their high speed provided by jet power, and delivering, if necessary, a nuclear weapon. Despite the spending cuts, the British aviation community was led by men of extraordinary vision and entrepreneurial spirit. Men such as George Edwards at Vickers, Roy Chadwick under the patronage of Sir Roy Dobson at Avro, and Reginald Stafford and Godfrey Lee, who worked for Sir Frederick Handley Page of Handley Page fame. Their rivalry was as intense as it was productive.
At one stage, and I can't recall exactly when this happened, Handley Page design team and Avro design team decided that it would be worthwhile them comparing notes about the Vulcan and the Victor and trying to achieve the best result for the country as a whole. And a meeting was actually formed at Cricklewood with Avro designers attending and discussing, or starting at the beginning of the meeting to discuss the merits of each other's designs, when Sir Roy Dobson at Avro's found out what was going on because he wanted to see one of the people that turned out to be Radlett, and he said, "What?" Or at Cricklewood, he said, "What's he doing at Cricklewood?" Discussing the Vulcan with Handley Page was the answer. He said, get him on the phone and bring all those people back instantly. And the meeting was stopped at about a quarter of the way through, I understand, and that was about the end of that. That was the way it went on, yes.
Out of the rivalry came some of the most dramatic and exciting aircraft ever to fly, brought together into a fighting unit that became known as the V-Force. The first of the aircraft to fly was the Vickers Type 660, making its maiden flight on May the 18th, 1951, with Mutt Summers at the controls. A month later, it was christened the Valiant, following a poll among Vickers employees to find a suitable name. The Valiant was a replacement for the short SA-4 Sperrin, which, due to numerous delays, had yet to fly. But it had already become clear that the performance of the Sperrin would not live up to expectations. The Valiant was far from being a pedestrian design, for by the austere standards of its day, it was an impressive undertaking, both aerodynamically and structurally. The dimensions of the fuselage were dictated by the need to carry the H-2S radar scanner in the nose, the pressurized cabin accommodating a crew of 5, and the dimensions of the bomb bay. The airframe structure was centered on a massive backbone member extending along the top of the fuselage. The wing spars branched off the fuselage backbone, giving the Valiant its muscular, shoulder-mounted wings. The wings featured a compound sweep, which meant that the angle of sweep was more acute at the root than at the tips. 4 Rolls-Royce Avon turbojets were bellied within the wing root area, each generating 6,500 pounds of thrust. But perhaps the major innovation of the Valiant was the use of all-electric systems, making the aircraft very light to fly.
But my first flight in the Valiant at RF Gaydon, when I did the conversion, was that of size. You could tell that you were handling something much larger, but still relatively light on the controls because of things like power controls, power-operated controls. And there really wasn't a great deal different in the technique. One could say that it was a larger, like a 4-engine Canberra.
The Valiant was a remarkable achievement, for George Edwards had convinced the air staff that not only could he have a flying prototype of the Valiant ready in 1951, but that production versions would be ready before the end of 1953. This was just what the air staff wanted to hear, given the wider political picture that was beginning to unfold. The Berlin blockade in 1948, followed by the building of the Berlin Wall, marked the beginning of the Cold War. Soon, there would be war in Korea. Finally, the Soviets' nuclear bomb program was at an advanced stage. By 1949, they had detonated their first nuclear device. The nuclear club had a new member. The pressure was intense, but on August the 30th, 1952, the next of the V-bombers, the Avro Type 698, made its maiden flight.
Now, with respect, the day we rolled it out on that Saturday morning, I think it was August the 5th, I forget now, 1952, and Rowley Fault flew it, the superintendent of flying, and Rowley Fault walked out of that aircraft with just his lounge suit on and his leather helmet, just as if he was going for an afternoon's drive. When he went down the runway, he lifted it, and we thought, oh no, it's not good, and it was up. He didn't lift the undercarriage, he was airborne for 2.25 hours. Now that 2.25 hours that he was airborne, he stopped the whole of the traffic in the Manchester area. They'd never seen anything like it, because it was a great Delta bomber, you know. They'd seen the little ones flying, but not a big one like that. They all thought they were being invaded from outer space. Their telephones were red hot, police cars were tearing about, this, that, the other. because it was all kept ashore, so we'd kept it shut up down there. He came back, he landed it, and he just got out, and he walked, and we all clapped him, and he just raised his hand, he just walked away as if he'd just been out for an afternoon's drive in a mini miner. Now then, a week later, he was taking the aircraft down to Farnborough to the air show. And he took off from here again on his own. And when he got to Farnborough, he rolled it like a fighter. He got a bollocking for it, but he still rolled it. We all heard about this. We thought, oh, we can't have it, but he did. Now, then, 10 days later, he's coming back to Woodford with it. And we knew he'd arranged the flight back at dinner time because all the crowd were outside to watch him come in with it. This marvellous aircraft had been built at Woodford. We saw him coming. He comes over the new assembly, which is the building across the road, the assembly sheds, and he reaches the end of the boiler house. He spins it and rolls it like over the factory from one end to the other, straightens it up in the air, shatters everything, you know, lands it and just walks away. And he broke all the glass in the roof, cracked it. And the glass in the roof was taped up for many years till the roof was redone.
From the outset, the Vulcan, as it became known, was recognized as being an extremely advanced design, both aerodynamically and as a manufacturing undertaking. The Type 698 was initially penned by Avro's chief designer, Roy Chadwick, who was tragically killed before he found out that the Air Ministry had accepted Avro's tender. In order to investigate the flying properties of the Delta wing, 1/3 scale replicas were built. Designated the 707, 2 were built to investigate the flying properties of a Delta wing of slow speed, while 2 others were built to investigate high-speed properties. However, such was the pace of development with the Type 698 program that by the time the first 707 flew in 1951, metal was already being cut for the Vulcan prototype. The prototypes were initially powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Avon turbojets, but it is the Bristol Olympus series of engines which have become synonymous with the Vulcan's staggering performance. However, further test flights at Boscombe Down revealed problems with the near-perfect delta shape. Buffeting was experienced when pulling G at high altitude, which in the long term would shorten the fatigue life of the aircraft's structure. The solution was to incorporate a kink into the leading edge, so that the inboard sweep was reduced whilst the outboard sweep was increased. This would become the standard layout for all future Vulcans, and one which made flying the Vulcan a truly unforgettable experience.
I think the combination of perhaps the installed engine power and also a technicality that the aircraft performance frequently depends on the ratio of its weight to its wing area. The more the wing area for a given weight, the tighter the aircraft can turn. Plus, the Vulcan, the sort of triangular shape, was inherently strong, which gave it, I think, probably slightly higher G limits than the other aircraft. And certainly that combination gives you the very tight turns, plus fighter-type control column, a lot of manoeuvrability. I mean, we thought it was wonderful, and just before the Falklands, we had the Victor pilots come up and train us for the tanking. And yes, of course, their first love is the Victor, and they would defend it to their dying day. But I think they were impressed by the Vulcan. They rather liked what they saw. I remember Pete standing, we did a couple of manoeuvres, and he sort of said, oh, can I do that again? And we did them so many times that the fuel got a little bit low. He was really enjoyed himself. Lovely aircraft.
The formidable reputation of a 4-engine jet bomber, which sounded rather fearsome, was dispelled by the Vulcan, which was, in many ways, a very good fighter in performance terms, and beautifully easy to handle, and very few, compared with the Canberra, potential malfunctions and disasters.
As the Vulcan began its flight trials, the third V-bomber prototype, the Victor, was nearing completion. The Victor would go on to be the longest-serving V-bomber, not being retired from RAF Strike Command until 1993. It was also the first heavy bomber to go supersonic.
So we did another run and went to about the same indicated Mach number. And that was it. And there were no handling problems. Everything worked perfectly normally. The whole aeroplane was smooth without any shaking. There was no evidence of exceeding Mach 1 in terms of trim changes or anything at all. The whole thing was perfectly smooth. And we returned to Radlett. And when I got back, I went into the control tower to see the air traffic controller, and I said, "You didn't happen to hear a supersonic bang at about 20 past 11 this morning, did you?" "No." So I asked one or two others around. No, nobody, didn't seem to occur to anybody. So that was that. But on Monday morning, we discovered, this was a Saturday, in fact, we were doing this. On Monday morning, we discovered that there had been a good supersonic bang all over Watford and one or two other places. And it so happened that Charles Joy, the chief designer at Handley Page, had been shopping in Watford, and he'd witnessed it, and he knew what the time was. And the time coincided precisely. And so there was no argument. But, of course, the aerodynamicists immediately took all our records and this, that, and the other off the aeroplane and analysed them and said, yep, it was supersonic.
By 1945, it was obvious to Sir Frederick Handley Page that the RAF would require a jet bomber replacement for the Lincolns. Consequently, he directed his design team to begin work on a bomber design. During 1946, the design was developed into a formal proposal. At the time, there was very little data available about the flying characteristics of a delta wing, and it was thought that such a design would be rendered unworkable due to stability problems. As a compromise, Handley Page opted for a crescent wing shape.
With the crescent wing, what happens is that the inner part of the wing, close to the fuselage, is the thickest part. It houses the engines and all the structure to carry the rest of the wing. And as the wing moves out, away from there, you can let it get thinner. So you achieve your high Mach number characteristics on the inboard section of the wing by sweeping it heavily. As you progress outboard, where the wing gets thinner, to achieve the same high Mach number characteristic, you don't need to sweep it so much. And so in the case of the Victor, there was high sweep inboard, and then that cut off in two stages out towards the tip. So that the tips were not anything like as swept back as the rest of the leading edge of the wing, or the inboard part of the leading edge. And this achieved similar high-speed characteristics right across the wing. Didn't help the low-speed handling, but it was good for high speed, and that's what was needed.
By April 1948, the design had been refined sufficiently for a contract for 2 prototypes to be built. The Victor, as it was now named, was to be powered by 4 Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire turbojets, each capable of delivering 7,500 pounds of thrust. Like the Valiant and the Vulcan, the engines were buried deep in the wing root. The wingtip fins were soon dispensed with, and following advice from the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, the tailplane was moved from its mid-position to the top of the fin. The tailplane was a huge fixed section with a pair of large elevators. Its span was just 11 inches shorter than the wingspan of the Hawker Hunter. To explore the characteristics of their design still further, Handley Page decided to construct a piloted flying model, the HP-88. The exercise proved to be almost pointless, as the Victor program continued independently of the smaller research vehicle. Not only was the Victor aerodynamically advanced, it also pushed back the frontiers of manufacturing knowledge. The Victor was constructed using a honeycomb sandwich riveted or spot welded to the wing and fuselage frames. Not only was this immensely strong, but also very light. The first prototype was assembled at Radlett in anticipation that this is from where the Victor would make its first flight. The Ministry of Supply, however, was concerned that the runway was not long enough and demanded that the aircraft be transported to Boscombe Down, disguised as a boat. Amid great secrecy, the Victor was assembled and made ready for its maiden flight.
We didn't know anything about it until B Squadron's hangar, which was the one that I was working from, had to have a lot of space cleared in it suddenly. And we didn't really know why, but on the Monday morning when we came to work, we discovered the reason was that it was full of chunks of Victor, and that people were busily, even almost immediately, starting to put this thing back together. And yes, I mean, the whole thing was still terribly hush-hush, but then the whole of Boscombe Down was, you know, everything was sworn to secrecy. You weren't allowed to go outside the place and talk about it, but you could talk about it inside the place. They couldn't stop us. It was in our hangar, and we began to see this thing being built. And it was really quite a revolutionary affair, I can tell you, in those days, for a big aeroplane. I mean, swept-wing aeroplanes were about for small ones, but for a big aeroplane, this really looked quite fantastic. And then we saw the outer wings put on with these great chunks of nose flap hanging down. That looked quite extraordinary in those days.
Then, on Christmas Eve 1952, the conditions were just right, and the Victor took to the air for the very first time with Chief Test Pilot Squadron Leader Hedley George Hazelden at the controls. The Victor flew as well as it looked, and in the years that followed would leave an indelible impression on all who flew it.
Well, once again, not unlike the Valiant, it was immediately a super piece of equipment to fly and comfortable, and you felt at home with it straight away. And fairly soon after I started flying it, I was able to take it to high altitude, and I quite early on had it up to 50,000 feet without any trouble, much more easily than I'd ever had anything else up to that height. And the only previous aeroplane I'd had that high was a Canberra in Boscombe Down days. And it got there much more easily. And the other great thing about it was that its Mach number capability was so good, it didn't have any, or at least any apparent compressibility problems. At any Mach number up to about 0.93, which was really going some in those days, because most aeroplanes were getting into trouble around 0.82 Mach number.
On the 15th of July 1953, the Victor made its public debut at the Queen's Coronation Review at Odeon. As wave after wave of aircraft flew by in salute, the newly crowned Queen Elizabeth must have marveled at the strength and power of her Air Force. Soon the Meteors and Vampires would be replaced by Hawker Hunters and English Electric Lightnings, providing the country's aerial defense. The Washingtons would be returned to America within months, as Britain now had the makings of a modern jet bomber force that could rival any other in the world. All that was needed now was a nuclear weapon to guarantee Britain's status as a superpower. The assumption that it would be an American nuclear bomb had been abruptly cut short in 1947, when the US passed the Atomic Energy Act proposed by Senator McMahon. The act prohibited any further cooperation with Britain over atomic research, despite the role played by British scientists in building the first American atom bomb. The chill caused by America's isolationist policy left Britain no alternative but to develop her own nuclear arsenal. On the 11th of October 1956, a Valiant successfully dropped a 10,000-pound Blue Danube freefall bomb over Maralinga in Australia. The following year, Britain's first thermonuclear, or hydrogen bomb, was dropped 400 miles off Christmas Island in the Pacific as part of the Operation Grapple tests. The third of these drops produced Britain's first megaton detonation. Britain's place at the superpower table was now assured, and America keen to rebuild a special relationship.
Don't you hear the H-bomb's thunder echo like the crack of doom? While they ran the skies asunder, all else lay the earth
The aircraft was painted in a special anti-thermal flash paint. There were no black dielectric covers for the radar components on the outside. This was all, and even the flying controls, the seals on the flying controls were all made of a special anti-radiation neoprene material. The other item of equipment, which is very essential, was we had to black out the whole of the crew cabin. And so at a certain time, prior to the bombing run, all the blackout screens went up, so the whole cabin was sealed. The only small slot was immediately in front of the captain on the left-hand side, which was a very heavily smoked glass screen, a matter of 3 or 4 inches by 1 inch or so, very small slot. Now, on the explosion of the weapon, we felt this in the form of 2 shock waves. The first one was the immediate air blast, and this affected our instruments in that the vertical speed indicator went to full-scale deflection, i.e. 4,000 feet a minute down, and then settled back again to 0. The second shock was the reflected ground wave several seconds later, and it did shake the aircraft, there was no doubt. It was quite a thump that we felt. By this time, we were going away from the explosion. We had our tail towards it, having completed an escape maneuver. And this escape maneuver involved turning through, I think, about 135 degrees and pulling an exact amount of G. We had a very accurate accelerometer fitted, and I believe it was something in the order of about 1.7 G. Not a lot, but at that amount of G, we could guarantee to have completed the escape maneuver. And so immediately we had completed the escape maneuver, down came the blackout screens, and there we were able to see the results of our efforts. This huge mushroom cloud way up into the stratosphere.
The first Vulcan B-1s went into squadron service with No. 83 Squadron based at Waddington in July 1957. In April the following year, No. 10 Squadron at Cottesmore became the first operational squadron to receive the Victor B-1. The V-Force was complete.
It was very exciting. I think that's more the word. Thinking back, I suppose we did feel that we were entering a new era in operational flying.
There was a great air of expectation and pride at being selected to fly these new bombers. One considered oneself in the elite, if you like.
It had been obvious for some time that getting a free-fall bomb to any sort of Soviet target would be almost suicidal, as the Soviets rapidly improved their defensive capability. The answer lay in standoff weapons, missiles which could fly themselves to the target after being launched from an aircraft. In March 1956, Avro was awarded the contract to build Blue Steel. Blue Steel was 35 feet long and carried a red snow thermonuclear warhead. It used rocket propulsion and had a range of 100 miles. A Valiant B-1 was used in the early trials, which, despite some initial setbacks, were extended to other V-bombers. By 1963, Blue Steel was ready to go into service. However, a Mark II version was already in development, which would have had a much longer range. But progress was slow, and it was cancelled in favor of the Douglas Skybolt from America, which was scheduled to replace Blue Steel in 1965. It transpired that the Victors could not carry Skybolt, so Avro began to adapt 72 Vulcans. These were the new Mark IIs, which had arrived in service at Christmas 1960. These aircraft had a more powerful engine, the uprated 16,000-pound Olympus, which could push the Vulcan up to Mach 0.98. An enlarged wing which gave it an improved service ceiling of 55,000 feet, as well as a host of new electronic countermeasures equipment. But the RAF's plans went awry in November 1962, when President Kennedy cancelled Skybolt.
The problem with Skybolt is it's the most sophisticated weapon imaginable. We put $500 million into it already. To fire a missile from a plane moving at high speed.
Following much diplomatic and political maneuvering, Kennedy agreed to let the British have the submarine-launched Polaris. The timetable for the demise of Britain's airborne nuclear deterrent was set. In the meantime, Bomber Command would continue with Blue Steel and free-fall bombs. By 1963, NATO's response policy to the Soviet threat was in place. The bulk of the strategic responsibility was placed on the shoulders of the awesome American Boeing B-52s of Strategic Air Command. They were supported by batteries of medium-range and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Europe's contribution to the nuclear deterrent rested solely with the V-Force. A tripwire policy meant that any Soviet aggression would be countered by a massive nuclear strike. This meant that British bomber crews were always on instant readiness. Quick Reaction Alert, or QRA, was designed to disperse the aircraft to airfields around the UK. There, the crews would live either in readiness huts next to their aircraft or in the aircraft themselves.
Captain to AO, timing checks, oxygen, Captain. Co-pilot, offer, right up, AO, content 7/8.
Life was fairly tedious. There's no getting away from that. You sat around for 24 hours or went to sleep in a caravan, waiting for the whistle to blare. But it was an opportunity to do other things. Of course, you did quite a bit of target study while you were on QRA. And that was simply sort of locking yourself away in a secure room and getting your target material out and working on that.
Essentially then you would deploy the aircraft to wherever, set yourself up, and you'd end up with 4 aircraft on the ORP, fully fueled, weapons as required, not nuclear weapons for a dispersal obviously, and we'd be plugged into what they called the telescramble, which if you like was a phone all the way back to Bomber Command. The crews would be sitting in, we had little caravans that were taken around if there was no purpose-built accommodation, and you'd sit there and in the background, I always remember, you'd have this beep about every 10-15 seconds, which was just to prove that the line to Bomber Command was still open. And then at the appropriate time, which you'd always try and second guess and usually get it wrong, there'd be a message from Bomber Command or Strike Command as it became, raising the alert state. Now the normal alert state was called Readiness 1.5, and at Readiness 1.5 that meant you were in flying kit, you were in the vicinity of the aircraft in the caravans or having a meal, and 1.5 meant you had to be airborne within 15 minutes. They could then raise that to Readiness 0.5, which meant you had to be airborne within 5 minutes. So for that, you would go out to the aircraft, strap in, do some preliminary checks, but wouldn't start the engines, because if you start the engines, you're burning fuel, which of course limits the time. There was up to 0.2, which was airborne in 2 minutes. For that, you did start the engines. Of course, there's a finite time then of how long the Lords and Masters can hold you at that alert state, and the ultimate one of scramble. And the normal one for us was Readiness 0.5 would be called. A few minutes after we got into the aircraft, they would scramble us, and then everything worked extremely well. The aircraft was designed, one button, press that, all 4 engines start, the powered flying controls run up. Everything was designed to automatically snatch out the back. You didn't bother with unplugging anything, just opened the throttles and went. In theory, the number 1 aircraft went first, but if he was delayed, he'd be elbowed out of the way by the number 2. And you just went. And as soon as you're airborne, start to disperse in the air to get out of the way of any incoming missiles. And certainly, Readiness 1.5, no trouble at all. If you said scramble from Readiness 1.5, we'd be a bit upset if people weren't airborne within 6 or 7 minutes if they were living close to the aircraft. Maybe 10 minutes if they had to take a transport. It was good. It was practice regularly. It worked.
The essence of V-bomber operations and the aim of all crew training in the past had been to fly and launch missiles from high level. But in May 1960, new evidence of the development of Soviet missiles emerged. Then, an American U-2 spy plane, piloted by Gary Powers, was shot down by a surface-to-air missile over Soviet territory at a height of 65,000 feet, a full 10,000 feet higher than the operational ceiling of the V-bombers. This, together with the cancellation of Skybolt, effectively signaled the end of high-level operations. Over the next 3 years, procedures were revised to bring operations down to low level, first at 1,000 feet, and eventually, when conditions allowed, as low as 50 feet.
One of the beauties of the Vulcan was, of course, it was extremely responsive on the controls. It handled more like a fighter. You even had a fighter stick, even though a great big wheel. So the low-level operation didn't actually cause much of a problem.
Although blue steel could be launched at low level, new methods had to be devised for free-fall bombs. This led to the use of the Labs maneuver, which exploited the handling characteristics of the V-Force aircraft to the full.
In the show in 1958, we demonstrated a low-level run across the runway, pulling the aircraft up into a half loop and rolling it off the top. And the excuse for doing this was, yes, it's a demonstration of a Labs maneuver. The whole maneuver was done entirely inside service limits for the aeroplane. We didn't exceed the service limits at all. We used the maximum speed that the aircraft would be cleared to service for, which was 360 knots. And in the loop, or the half loop, we pulled 2G, which was also inside the service limits. Rolling the aircraft off the top, of course, doesn't exceed anything. It's an entirely 1G maneuver. And so, okay, it just made something good to look at Farnborough for a big aeroplane to do. You could only do it if the cloud was reasonably clear, because we went into the bottom of this thing at about 500 feet and over the top at about 8,000 feet.
But there was to be a price to pay. The conditions at low level meant there would be thicker air and more turbulence, putting more stress on the aircraft's structure. This would inevitably shorten its life, and the first to suffer was the Valiant. Having flown low-level operations for Strategic Air Command Europe for 2 years, already the Valiants began to show alarming structural problems. In December 1964, a routine examination of one Valiant showed fatigue cracks in the main spar. A rapid checking of all other aircraft revealed the same problem. There was no alternative but to ground the whole fleet of Valiants from early 1965.
We heard all about this, the famous incident at Gaydon, where one of the flying instructors was flying a sortie, and there was a tremendous crack, and one of the spars on the right wing, I think it was, actually broke. They were able to reduce speed, fly back to Gaydon, RAF Gaydon, near Leamington Spa, and the crack was so bad that in fact it disconnected the drive to the right, to the starboard flap. So one flap came down and the other didn't. And so the captain very quickly realized that this was, and so he rolled his flaps back in again, because obviously the aircraft was starting to roll quite badly. And they landed this aircraft. He did a magnificent job of getting it down onto the runway, flapless. When the crew stepped out, they all walked round to the right-hand side, and they saw daylight through the wing root of where the starboard wing was joined. And that's how lucky that crew were.
The grounding of the Valiants was not without some irony, for even before the first production B-1s had been delivered, a special low-level B-2 version had been built. It had been ordered at a time when Bomber Command felt there was still a role for its Pathfinder force, but was soon cancelled when it was recognized that dropping nuclear bombs did not require that degree of accuracy. Had it gone into operational service, then it might well have been the Mark II versions of the Vulcan and Victor that found themselves redundant following the decision to go low-level. The grounding of the Valiants and the transfer of the nuclear deterrent to the Navy at some point in the future did mean there was a need to reorganize the way in which the V-Force functioned. Admittedly, there were some cutbacks in orders. The Mark II Victor, equipped with the mighty Rolls-Royce Conway engines, was the first to suffer when almost half the order was cancelled, leaving the RAF with only 34 of them.
When the Mark II came along, yes, that was absolutely superb with the amount of power we had. The original Conway 11 wasn't the definitive engine for the aircraft. The definitive engine was the Conway 17. I think I'm getting my numbers right. And it delivered 20,500 pounds of thrust. And that flew just about a year later, and subsequently they all had the big Conways in them. That really gave the aeroplane some oomph. For instance, you could sit a Mark II Victor on the end of the runway, and provided that the radar air traffic controllers would give you a clear climb out, open up the power against the brakes, and at about 85% power, the airplane was going to move anyway. It wouldn't hold it. The brakes didn't slip. It was just dragging it along the ground on the tires. So you didn't let it do that. At the moment it started to want to move, let go of the brakes, hit full power, and from the moment of letting the brakes go, you could consistently have that aircraft out of 20,000 feet in 2 minutes and 8 seconds, and up to 40,000 feet in 8 minutes. Now, for an aeroplane of this size, this was really performance, without a doubt.
But the V-Force would continue for three major reasons. Firstly, TSR-2 had been cancelled amid controversy and recrimination. With no credible replacement in sight, it was left to the Vulcan to maintain the RAF's strike capability. Secondly, NATO put pressure on the British government to retain the V-bombers as tactical strike aircraft to counter the threat of the huge Warsaw Pact ground forces in Central Europe. Finally, in-flight refueling techniques had been perfected during the 50s using Valiants as tankers. The ability to refuel in flight greatly extended the reach of the RAF, enabling it to give up bases in some of the more far-flung reaches of the globe. Fighter Command had also come to rely on in-flight refueling to extend the range of its frontline aircraft. When the Lightning came into service, it had an endurance of little more than 40 minutes, an impractical proposition without the ability to refuel. With constant top-ups from a tanker, these aircraft could fly almost indefinitely. With the loss of the Valiants, the role was assigned to the Victors. Almost immediately, every available Mark I was converted. The first 6 were equipped with 2 retractable refueling hoses in pods under the wings. The next 25 had a third hose fitted into the bomb bay. By the end of 1966, 3 squadrons were fully operational as tankers. In 1968, the Victor was withdrawn from the bomber force altogether because of the impending delivery of Polaris to the Royal Navy, and because of the uncertain future of Handley Page aircraft. Ironically, the contract to convert the remaining B-2s to K-2 tankers was awarded to Avro. The reach of the V-Force was demonstrated to dramatic effect during the Falklands War in 1982, when Vulcans, refueled by Victors, flew the longest bombing mission in history.
Part of the deal of the Vulcan is a threat, and we'd made it clear that we physically had the ability to bomb the Argentinian mainland, so the Argentinian Air Force had to reserve a fair proportion of its fighters to defend the homeland. This means that when they put their A4s in against the fleet, they essentially were going in unescorted, and the aircraft that could have been there and interfering with the operations and taking out the Harriers were being held back to defend the mainland. Again, one of the contributions that the Vulcan made.
The Vulcan was already being replaced by the Tornado GR-1, and the RAF also had Buccaneers, which could fly low-level bombing missions equipped with the latest weapon guidance technology. But neither aircraft could carry sufficient payload that distance. Preparing the Vulcans had to be carried out in record time.
We trained at 43,000 feet and 500 feet, and it was such an unusual thing that when they were looking for statistical figures to work out bomb dropping, they actually had to go back to the B-29 missions over North Korea during the Korean War. That was the last time medium-level bombing had been done. We didn't have tables for those kind of... A lot of things had to be dug up. And in fact, the Vulcans, of course, were going out of service. As we were bombing over the Falklands, they were breaking up Vulcans at Waddington. And a lot of the equipment that we were carrying down with us had actually been rescued from the scrap. There were people who had never done 1,000-pound bombing in their lives before. And again, we had to find one of the very, very experienced nav radars who was briefing people on kit that, of course, had been his life in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But he never thought he was going to be trotting this information out in the 80s. Never throw anything away. You'll never know when you might need it.
No less than 11 Victor tankers were needed. On each sortie, the single Vulcan was refueled 5 times on the trip out and once on the way back. The Victors themselves needed to be refueled 10 times. The pilot on the second sortie was Squadron Leader John Reeve.
There was very little radar activity, quite frankly, over the islands. We cast off at about 250 miles north of the islands and dropped down to low level. And again, no one was for one moment doubting that the Argentinians were a fairly professional force. I mean, their pilots are as good as anyone, no suggestion there. But what we felt was, if you're going to intercept an aircraft at night, an awful lot of things have got to go right. And they've got to go right on a very technical level. And while I had no doubt about the Argentinian pilots, we were not convinced that the Argentinian conscript technicians could necessarily, do the little technical things, make sure the generator's at exactly the right frequency so the radar picture is perfect, that the radar is correctly set up. And certainly when we went in very low level to avoid the radar. We then climbed up to about 14,000 feet and bombed from that height, which was above the effective range of their light anti-aircraft guns. It also had the advantage that the bombs, when dropped, would strike the runway nearly vertically, so there was no possibility of them bouncing off. They would penetrate well through and blow up in the subsoil and really heave the runway up. So we were not picked up by the radar, and to some extent I'm not surprised in that to operate a radar on the Falklands 24 hours a day in those conditions is not easy. I'm not sure the very finest Argentinian troops were put ashore. And we felt by day I'd have been very, very wary of going. But by night, when everything's got to be a technical thing, we felt we were in with a reasonable chance.
But this really was the last gasp for the Vulcan, and in 1984, they were removed from operational service. One example was kept flying, performing in many air shows when it dazzled the crowds with its noise and fighter-like maneuvers. Then in 1992, it too made its last appearance. The Victor was the last of the V-Force to leave RAF service. Serving into the 1990s, it performed sterling service in the Gulf War, refueling not only RAF aircraft, but those of many of the coalition partners. Alongside 10 VC-10s and TriStars, the 7 Victors took their share of 299 sorties in just 42 days, helping to deliver 13,000 tons of fuel to the thirsty strike aircraft. For 38 years, the skies of Britain shuddered under the noise of these great four-jet engined bombers. As conventional bombers, nuclear carriers, and tankers, they performed their tasks with style and grace. Although designed to meet the needs of the Cold War, they represent a pinnacle of aviation design. As to whether the airborne nuclear deterrent was justified, who can say? History suggests that it was. It provided a reason for the Americans to continue the close relationship with Britain, and thus guaranteeing the safety of Western Europe for 40 years. As to the cost, one should heed the words of Sir Frederick Handley Page when he said, "Nobody has ever won a war by trying to run it on the cheap. Nothing is so expensive as losing a war by saving money." If you want the cheapest possible Air Force today, it is very easy to standardize on a whole lot of aircraft, which will be of no use when a war comes.